So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I think we will start the session. My name is Jennifer Croft. I'm the Deputy Head of the Human Rights Department at ODIHR. And I'd like to welcome you to this working session 6 on the topic of fundamental freedoms, including freedom of peaceful assembly and association. The rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and association are crucial for effective public participation and to the functioning of vibrant, pluralistic, and participatory democracies. These rights are also instrumental in enabling the full and effective exercise of other civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. Among the tools and other forms of assistance that ODIHR provides to participating states on these issues, including monitoring of peaceful assemblies, I would note the third edition of the ODIHR Venice Commission Joint Guidelines on Freedom of Assembly, which will be presented later today. This morning's session will aim to demonstrate how the establishment of a culture of dialogue between states, civil society, and individuals, including those from marginalized or underrepresented groups, and the full implementation of the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and association, fosters relationships based on mutual trust, and serves to achieve democracy, human rights, and security. This session will last 3 hours. The first 15 minutes will be dedicated to these opening words, technical information, and the remarks by our introducer. This will be followed by approximately 2 hours and 15 minutes for interventions from the floor. During the last 15 minutes, delegations of participating states will have the possibility to exercise their right of reply. And if there is time, we will turn back to our speaker for some final summary reflections, after which I will close the session. I would like to mention there's a few spaces left on the speakers list. If you're interested to sign up on the speaker list, please see my colleague behind me. The maximum number of participants that we can sign up to speak is 50. As always, seats in this hall are designated and are indicated by signs placed throughout the table. I would like to ask all participants to respect this seating arrangement throughout the session. As you probably know, the live streaming of this 2019 Human Dimension Implementation meeting is available, and filming with cameras and video cameras is permitted only by accredited journalists and only during the opening and closing sessions. No other audiovisual recordings should be undertaken without explicit permission of the individuals being recorded. It's now my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker for this session, Ms. Diana Olivia Hatneanu, an attorney and independent expert from Romania. Ms. Hatneanu has been a member of the Bucharest Bar Association since 2001. Her work is focused on a variety of human rights issues, including the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly, freedom of association, freedom of expression and access to information, freedom of thought, and fair trial standards in both criminal and civil procedures. She has been working with Romanian and international NGOs for more than 20 years and has extensive experience in human rights issues, advocacy, and litigation, successfully representing victims of human rights violations both before domestic courts and the European Court of Human Rights. She was previously the executive director of APADOR CH, the Romanian Helsinki Committee, one of the main human rights groups in Romania, and has been actively involved in campaigning to further the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and to freedom of association in Romania. I would also mention that in her capacity as a civil society expert, she participated in the process of developing the ODIHR Guidelines on Freedom of Association, which were published in 2014. Now it's my pleasure to give the floor to Ms. Diana Olivia Hatneanu.
Thank you. Welcome to the session on freedom of peaceful assembly and association, rights of constant concern for the OACE's Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, and treated as such during the Human Dimension implementation meetings. Along the years, both flagrant threats and gross violations, as well as more insidious limitations to the exercise of these core freedoms, have been discussed during the OACE's annual event, and I assume this year shall be no different. As my role is not to provide an exhaustive presentation, but to kickstart a valuable discussion on the current state of affairs in the OAC area, as well as the needs to be addressed, I shall focus more on worrying trends, seasoned with examples of how the civil space is narrowing to leave less space for civil scrutiny and accountability, as well as less space for structured dialogue between authorities and civil society. I am certain your further input shall provide a more in-depth image on how we currently stand with freedom of peaceful assembly and association, and what can be done to counteract the worrying trends. As regards the freedom of peaceful assembly, we have actually witnessed quite a number of cases where national authorities have resorted to excessive force to counter or repress peaceful protests. For example, on 27 July 2019 in Moscow, it was reported that the law enforcement agencies used force to disperse protests and apprehend more than 1,000 protesters who remained detained for 2 days. On 20 June 2019, violent confrontations took place between Georgian police and demonstrators in Tbilisi, resulting in dozens of demonstrators, journalists, and police officers being injured. In such cases, the first response shall always have to be immediate, effective, and thorough investigation, able to identify and hold accountable those responsible for the excessive use of force. Moreover, the public should be constantly informed on the steps of the investigation and its results. Although the obligation to investigate is well established under Article 2 and 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights, it is rarely fully observed by the states. For example, the criminal investigation into the use of force to disperse a peaceful protest in Bucharest on 10 August 2018 has not been finalized, although information on the status of the investigation has been provided by the prosecution regularly in an open manner, a practice which has to be encouraged for similar situations. One reason for the delay to fully investigate the use of force in this particular case was the classification of relevant documents by some of the state actors involved. Therefore, the classification of information the delays in declassifying such information should be avoided, as information on possible breaches of human rights should never be classified. This principle should be applicable also where counterterrorism legislation is used as an excuse to discourage or harass protesters, but also legitimate civil society work. The harassment of peaceful participants to various public assemblies is of particular concern where minorities or vulnerable groups are at stake. The most redundant case is the continuous harassment of sexual minorities' public assemblies, which still takes place in some OAC's member states. But sexual minorities are not the only ones facing the problem. For example, in Bulgaria, the Macedonian community is sometimes harassed by the police during their rallies, as reported by the Bulgarian Helsinki Committee. Such practices should simply cease, and national authorities in the OAC area must act with additional precaution where minority groups are concerned. One particular issue is a requirement of notifying public rallies, assemblies, or gatherings, a measure that it is not in itself considered as lacking a legitimate aim. Nevertheless, this system comes from the times where organizing public assemblies was done in a classic manner. Nowadays, the social media provided the means for a more spontaneous and diffused responsibility in organizing assemblies, which sometimes comes at odds to the requirement to notify the said assemblies. This is another element to be taken into consideration by the authorities when deciding to disperse a gathering which failed to observe the formal notification procedure, or when deciding to sanction participants. The failure to notify the assembly in itself should not have any such consequences, and only violent behavior should be sanctioned in a proportional manner. As regards the freedom of association, one worrying and continuous trend is the over-regulation of NGO activity. Although the issue is present for several years already, such is the case with the Russian Foreign Agents Act, there have been no improvements so far. On the contrary, the trend is accentuated in an overspill effect. For example, in Hungary, concerns about limiting the legitimate activities of NGOs and human rights defenders have been voiced since 2014, when additional administrative requirements and audits of NGOs have been introduced. Nevertheless, the Hungarian authorities have adopted the Act on the Transparency of Organizations Receiving Foreign Funding in 2017, and in 2018, the Stop Soros legislative package and the Act on Special Immigration Tax, adding to the restriction on legitimate civil society activities. In addition, the public labeling of NGOs as foreign agents or recipients of foreign funding is a disproportionate measure which fuels public smearing campaign, limits the outreach of organized civil society, and possibly even physical harassment of human rights defenders. If reporting on funding is required, for example, for the legitimate aim of preventing money laundering, such reporting should always be only towards the authorities, based on a thorough needs assessment. No excessive requirements and administrative burdens should be placed on the NGOs, and their role and specific functioning must be taken into account when deciding on those requirements after extensive public consultation with relevant stakeholders. The sanction for failing to respond to reporting requirements must also be proportionate and progressive. Disbanding NGOs for failing to report should only be a measure of last resort, to be used only in exceptional cases and only accompanied by means to appeal against the measure, both administratively and before a court of law, with the observance of the due process requirements. Moreover, when reporting requirements towards the authorities are justified by a legitimate aim, in order to keep the measure proportional and also enabling for the exercise of the freedom of association, the proper infrastructure should always be provided. For example, this July in Romania, a new law against money laundering was adopted, and new reporting requirements on the real beneficiaries of various legal entities were introduced. The repeated failure to report on the real beneficiaries can result in the disbanding of the entity. But while the commercial companies should report directly before the employees of the Commerce Registry annually, the NGOs are asked to provide notarized declarations also annually. This implies additional costs which can be very burdensome, especially for small civil society groups working mostly on voluntary basis. In this specific case, providing equal reporting opportunities to commercial and civil society entities might seem sufficient, but in other cases, the authorities must ensure a friendlier infrastructure for NGOs as compared with other entities, taking into account their public interest scope of work. Transparency of NGOs' funding and activities towards the public should be carried out on a voluntary basis and not imposed by the authorities. NGOs, on the other hand, should be open to demonstrate transparency on their funding and activities on their own, as transparency and open public communication can be at times the only means to counteract the stigma placed on them by the constant smear campaigns in some member states. Civil society groups should develop tools for enhanced transparency and good communication, taking into account the new media and the new technology opportunities. Last but not least, the criminalization of legitimate civil society work is probably the most worrying trend of all. For example, in Hungary, the newly adopted amendments to the Criminal Code criminalize the assistance provided to asylum seekers to exercise their legal right to submit an asylum application. In Germany, in June 2019, the parliament adopted a bill to facilitate the removal of people under the obligation to leave the country, which classifies the information on the practical steps taken before the removal. Consequently, humanitarian NGOs or those defending the rights of refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants run the risk of being prosecuted for aiding and abetting the disclosure of confidential information. These or similar provisions should be amended, but even if the amendments are not adopted in due time, they should not be used against NGOs or members of civil society who provide legitimate assistance of any kind to refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants. While I'm eager to hear from the speakers in this session of other examples of both problems and solutions in respect to the freedom of peaceful assembly and association, I do not believe there is a miracle solution for widening the civil space in the OSCE area. In the end, there is nothing out of the ordinary in asking the member states to abstain from actions against legitimate civil society work or against legitimate protests. Such invitation to fully observe fundamental freedoms should also be accompanied by action. Good cooperation among civil society actors, public communication, transparency, and the use of all available legal and advocacy means to counteract such threats should be the landmarks of such action. I therefore invite you to further the discussion beyond these landmarks during the present session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hotneanu, for starting off our discussion with these very stimulating remarks, for outlining some of the key trends. I thought it was very interesting, your point on technology, how this is affecting the exercise of freedom of peaceful assembly, but can also be a very useful tool for civil society to increase their own transparency. Also, I appreciated that you mentioned some very practical measures that states can take to avoid even unintentional negative effects on civil society organizations, for example, concerning reporting requirements. And thank you for reminding us that we're here today to talk about problems and also solutions, even though, as you said, perhaps there's no miracle solution. Now that we've heard from our introducer, I'd like to inform all participants that based on the number of speakers we have signed up, the speaking time will be 3 minutes per intervention. I'd like to remind that participants can only speak in the capacity in which they are registered, and only entities which are registered on the speakers list may take the floor. All interventions should be presented in a meaningful, orderly, and respectful manner, observing the time limit, and focusing on recommendations related to the topic of the session. Please keep your comments brief and to the point, starting with the recommendations related to the session's topic, so freedom of peaceful assembly and freedom of association. Criticism is welcome, but should be constructive. I would encourage participants not to read lengthy prepared statements, but if you do have a prepared statement, please submit it before you take the floor to our interpreters. You can also distribute statements via the documentation distribution desk to ensure that the flow of documents reflects the discussion. I would also like to make a general reminder to states that points of order should only be on procedural grounds and may not address the substantive matter of discussion. With that, I would like to call on the first speaker on the list. This is the Movement for the Renaissance of the Northern Epirus. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mrs. Moderator. Honorable representatives, over the past 5 years, the Albanian state has used various methods to engage in psychological terrorism against members of the Greek nation minority who are active in the human rights struggle of their country. These people are being systematically detained by the Albanian police.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I do have a point of order, which I will need to take. Please, Albania.
Thank you, moderator. This is out of topic, and Albania attaches great importance to the protection and promotion of rights of national minorities and remains committed to continue to work further for strengthening the standards of protection of national minorities in its own country. And I reserve the right of reply to come back to this. Thanks.
please, you have the floor again.
We have to present documents, Mrs. Moderator. These people are being systematically detained by the Albanian police for hours at the Greek-Albanian border without being given the necessary explanations. They are being interrogated. Their free passage is thus being obstructed, not because they have committed a crime, but simply because they will not remain silent on the minority rights violation by the Albanian states. In a large number of persons, the entrance in the Albanian territory is forbidden just because they participated in minority events. Especially in the last year, following the unjust and unjustified murder of the member of the minority Konstantinos Katsifas by the Albanian police Special Forces Unit Rinia in the village of Vouliarates on October 28, 2018, these phenomena have been multiplied. On December 8, 2018, the Albanian authorities stopped about 200 Greek citizens, even people who were also citizens of Albania, from entering the Albanian territory in order to prevent them
I'm sorry,
from
I'll have to interrupt you again to take the point of order from Albania.
Ms. Moderator, this is totally out of topic, and I would kindly ask you to please ask to keep within the topic of today's meeting. Thanks.
I'll give the speaker back the floor.
Okay, thank you. From entering the Albanian territory in order to prevent them from attending Konstantinos Katsifas' memorial service. Stavros Ginos, a member of the Greek national minority, was in the detention center of Agis Saranda for 7 hours, answering various questions. He was then taken to the detention center of Argyrokastro, where he was interrogated for another 8 hours, answering the same question, a total 15 hours. At no point was he informed of any charges of the suspicion of any crime other than being active in the Greek minority affairs. Similar treatments was awaiting on that day many other Greeks of northern Epirus who were unjustly detained and interrogated for hours by the Albanian police. At the same time, the Albanian police set up roadblocks around the village of Vouliarates, checking all those who would go there in the village church to pray for the murdered young man. There are also cases of members of the Greek minority who were threatened by the Albanian police in the days before the memorial service and were forced not to attend. Albanian police repeated the same tactics on May 11, 2019, banning dozens of Greek citizens from attending Konstantinos Katsifas' 6-month memorial service. In no democratic
Well, I
country...
have to ask you to please wrap up. It's getting to the end of the time limit.
Oh, yes. I finished. The whole text will be in the documentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And again, just a reminder to delegations that there will be the option to make the right of reply at the end of the session. The next speaker on the list is the Eurasian Dialogue Institution. Please, you have the floor.
Good morning, Your Honorables, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Ravshan Temurian, Eurasian Dialogue, member of the board, Montreal, Canada. As international community noted, the government of Tajikistan severely restricts political rights and civil liberties, with total ban and elimination of the opposition parties within Tajikistan. The Tajik government practically ruling without any strategic or logic perception on the future of the state. The government of Tajikistan continue its policy against fundamental freedoms and against freedom of peaceful assembly and association. The government strictly limits freedom of assembly. Local government approval is required to hold demonstration, and officials often refuse to grant permission of authority, usually warn that participation in an unauthorized gathering would result in criminal charges. However, to blackmail the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the authorities, without any problem, organized the so-called protests and riots of the pro-government organization in front of the OSCE office in the capital of Tajikistan. By this kind of theatrical performance, the Tajik government only aggravates its already bad situation on human rights in the international arena. Eurasian Dialogue, the civil society, a group of lawyers, human rights defenders, and political experts at the OSCE Human Dimension Implementation meeting recommend. First, the international institution should beef up their presence in Tajikistan to ease hostility of the Tajik government toward public organization and civil society, and should promote good governance. Practice shows that the presence of international well-known organization within Tajikistan pushes the Tajik government to fulfill its international obligations. The second, the international community, including OSCE, must strictly trace the names of representatives of the government of Tajikistan involved in serious violations of the rights of Tajik citizens, members of civil society, persecution, opposition families.
Can you
to
please wrap
add
up?
them
The time has come to an end. Thank you.
to them in on the Magnitsky Act. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker on the list is the Kazakhstan International Bureau for Human Rights and the Rule of Law. Please, you have the floor.
Добрый день.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. In the years of its independence, the Republic of Kazakhstan has ratified a large number of international agreements about human rights, rights of the child, the liquidation of all forms of discrimination, the Convention Against Torture and other inhuman treatment, and also the International Covenant on Political and Rights, Civil and Economic Rights, and its first protocol. Now, despite Article 20 of the Constitution of the Republic of Kazakhstan, which guarantees the rights of citizens of the country to engage in peaceful assembly, the standards of these international agreements are in fact part of the legislation of the country at the national level. And so there is a conflict between the national standards and the international standards. As in practice, in fact, the political leadership of the country has in fact imposed its own order, its own standards, and has made it possible for special services and the forces of law and order to intervene forcefully in any gathering of citizens, and there is no real right to freedom of assembly, and this results in absurd situations. The citizens are in fact detained and charged not just for participation in such assemblies, but even for publishing an intent to organize such an assembly. Even that results in judicial proceedings. And individuals are detained simply for finding themselves in a given place, even if they don't intend to participate in that assembly. And this can happen to the elderly, even to children. Unfortunately, any attempts to complain about such a behavior of police officers before the courts is completely ignored. And even appeals to the Human Rights Committee, which recognizes that the state has committed violations, and yet the government ignores such decisions of the Human Rights Committee. Let me give you my example, just so that you know that I know whereof I speak. I have been on 4 occasions detained, taken from my home with no legal basis on the pretext that police officers want to interrogate me. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is the Spiritual Assembly of the Muslims of Russia. Please, you have the floor.
Good morning, Madam Chair, distinguished participants. On behalf of the Muslims of Russia and the Public Council to greet you this morning. First of all, I would like to welcome you all at 1:15 to a side event we will be holding in room 3 on the topic of looking for a balance of religion today against secularism, where we will also discuss the topic of holding assemblies and association of people, since there will also be a lunch served. We will like to invite you as well. In a UN resolution on the encouragement of intercultural, interreligious dialogue, cooperation for peace, passed on the 3rd of December of 2015. It notes the importance of maintaining the national religious identity. Now, coming back to our topic of this morning session, I would like to inform you that religious organizations hold very many public events, including events which are linked to religious celebrations. It's important for us for these laws to be stable and supported by all, and for everyone to be enjoyed. For example, when we hold religious celebrations, for example, the celebration of Bayram in Moscow, last time at the Karva Bayram celebration, there were over 300,000 Muslims who took part. In St. Petersburg, there were over 100,000 people. These events are held in respect of the law on holding mass events, and over 3,000 law enforcement officials help us to hold these events. Also, the Day of Celebration of Islam in Bulgar also brings together over 7,000 believers. Everyone needs to clearly understand that when we hold these mass events, it is very important to provide for the safety not only of participants, but also for society as a whole. And here we need to have the law upheld, and we also need to make sure that we call on civil society and religious organizations so that based on the rules and regulations, we should do this appropriately so that this does not lead to any major problems. We need to take into account the specificity of our cultures, our doctrines, our human rights documents, and the way we see our environments and how these cultures evolved. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I would like to now call on the next speaker from Political Movement Group 24. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you. Said Ali Ashur, Political Movement Group 24. Freedom of peaceful assembly and association is the milestone of democracy and theoretically protected by the Constitution of the Republic of Tajikistan. Conversely, the dictatorial regime of Tajikistan totally neglected the Constitution and treats the citizens by the criminal codes of the Constitution. Freedom of peaceful assembly and association already cracked down by the regime for decades of years. Dictator Emomali Rakhmonov is continuing pressure on civil societies and non-commercial organizations by additional administrative burdens via amendments to the law of public association. On 2nd of January 2019, Rakhmonov signed into law amendments to the law of public association a number of additional administrative burdens. These burdens are insufficiently clear and moreover pointless. Social sites and independent news agencies are the only way for describing ideas and opinions, but the regime always trying to limit the freedom of expression by compelling on communicational companies by increasing taxes, doubling internet and calling rates, and similar services introduced by Tajikistan operating system and put significant pressures on civil society actors, narrowing their space for civil society organization and peaceful demonstrations. This decision was taken by the Rakhmonov's authority after regularly and arbitrarily blocking access to the internet resources and many social sites which criticized by various international human rights organizations. In May 2019, the parliament passed a new legislation and signed by Dictator Rakhmonov that grants the authorities wide power to limit freedom of expression in time of martial law. This legislation was criticized by many human rights organizations. By the last 8 months, there were 3 serious incidents in the country that left more than 100 prisoners died. The regime forced their relatives to not have any contact with journalists to express their thought about the incident and their families. Since 2015, the NGOs and non-commercial organizations are under pressure and attack of the regime authorities. The NGOs asked from the authority to reform the law to continue their activities, but there was no any positive response. Even the law is not equal to the international standard. The ministry also refused to join the representative of NGOs in the new working group and finally called the NGOs emissary of the foreign countries. Civil society organizations working on human rights issues have recently faced growing pressures and some organizations have forced closed down. As a political activist asking from the human rights organization and democratic institution to not be silent on violating human rights in Tajikistan and have a clear position against dictatorial regime and avoid humanitarian catastrophe. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I would like to now go to the next speaker on the list, United States of America. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. The United States of America remains concerned about the freedom of peaceful assembly and association in the OSCE region. The Russian Federation treats the freedoms of association and peaceful assembly as threats rather than fundamental human rights. The mass detentions of thousands who assembled peacefully in Moscow this summer, excessive use of force against protesters, and disproportionate criminal charges brought against some of those detained all appear aimed at thwarting future demonstrations. We call for the release of Anastasia Shevchenko, the first person charged under Russia's 2015 Undesirable Organizations Law. In Russia-occupied Crimea, the arrest of 23 civic activists associated with Crimean Solidarity Network earlier this year marks a disturbing escalation in the repression of Crimean Tatars. In Belarus, authorities have denied registration, both as a political party and as an association, to the Belarusian Christian Democrats. The United States acknowledges the Polish government's recent condemnation of violence at an LGBT march in Poland and urges Polish officials to provide protection to those seeking to exercise their right to peaceful assembly. In Ukraine, while we commend police protection of the LGBTI parade in March in Kyiv, we urge the new government to take steps to end impunity for recent violent attacks on gatherings of LGBTI persons, human rights defenders, and others. The government in Hungary increased legal limitations on assembly in 2018, including on the location, timing, and content of demonstrations. Additional laws increased restrictions on NGOs working on migration issues. In Turkey, the government has closed more than 1,500 associations or foundations since the July 2016 failed coup attempt. We regret continued use of terrorism charges to dissolve and prosecute NGOs or associations who do not advocate for or engage in violence. While we acknowledge the very real security threats faced by Turkey, these closures, in addition to prohibitions on workers' strikes, amount to blanket violations of freedom of association. Authorities in Azerbaijan restrict freedom of association through criminal investigations into legitimate activities of independent organizations, freezing bank accounts, imposing undue limitations on NGO registration, and other measures. We are concerned by the detention of thousands of demonstrators around the June presidential election in Kazakhstan. Burdensome regulations severely restrict the freedom of Kazakhstanis to form associations and assemble peacefully. There are also obstacles to NGO registration, and reports of harassment and surveillance of human rights activities in Uzbekistan, despite a 2018 presidential decree. We also remain concerned by harsh repression of opposition parties in Tajikistan and remain concerned about the treatment, in particular, of Mamadli Hayat.
Sorry, I'll have to ask you to conclude. The
Thank
time
you.
is up. Thank you. The next speaker on the list is the representative of Russian Federation. please, you have the floor.
Good morning, moderator, dear colleagues. Unfortunately, I must note that a number of participating states in the OSCE area, under the pretext of ensuring the right to freedom of peaceful assembly, continue nevertheless to pander to neo-Nazi, nationalist, and right-wing forces. Radical statements by highly placed officials, parliamentarians, and civil society leaders unambiguously call for segregation, xenophobia, and inter-ethnic hatred. That's becoming more and more popular. We are very concerned by the fact that meetings of SS legionnaires continue to occur regularly in Latvia and Estonia. In Latvia, on a regular basis, we have marches of veterans of the Latin Volunteer Legion Waffen-SS. In Estonia, on an annual basis, there are assemblies of participants in the 20th Grenadier SS Division and their supporters, and monuments are erected to Nazi criminals, and we're very concerned about the situation in Ukraine. The slogan of the Ukrainian rebel army, "Glory to Ukraine, glory to heroes," is still the slogan of the armed forces of the country. And I would remind you that during the Second World War, the UPA actively participated with the Nazis in many crimes against humanity, including the Volyn massacre. The authorities of Bulgaria, despite regular protests by the local Jewish organizations, are closing their eyes to annual holding in Sofia of the neo-Nazi torch parade, the Lukov March. The participants wear military uniform, neo-Nazi symbols. In the last march, which took place on 16 February of this year, there were some 200 participants, including foreign citizens. And I believe that the authorities of the USA should pay very close attention to the activities of far right-wing groups which feel themselves very much at home in the United States. According to the recent data of the NGO Southern Poverty Law Center, certainly not a pro-Russian group, in the United States there are more than 100 extremist organizations that disseminate an ideology of hatred to the representatives of other races, nationalities, and religion. I'm thinking in particular of the racist group called 1488, which has been charged with illegal trade in arms, kidnapping of individuals, and assassinations. And in this connection, we would recommend to the OSCE to assess these deplorable events occurring in the OSCE area. This pandering to such groups should come to an end, and we would also call on participating states to support during the 74th session of the General Assembly of the UN the draft of the traditional resolution on combating the glorification of Nazism. Thank you for your attention. The full text will be made available to the Secretariat.
Recommendations and encourage subsequent speakers also to do so. I've also been reminded to call on the next speaker, but as well announce the following speaker so that speakers can be prepared that their turn is coming up. So the next speaker on the list is the Crimean Human Rights Group, which will be followed by Tajikistan. The Crimean Human Rights Group, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. The authorities of the Russian Federation continue to use on the occupied territory of Crimea the ban to holding peaceful assembly and the persecution of people who hold these assemblies without the de facto authorization. The administrative code is used that introduces administrative arrest or fines for holding assembly without the preliminary authorization from the authorities. Before the occupation in Crimea and in the non-occupied territory of Crimea by the Russian Federation, there are other methods which are being used without any need to have an authorization for peaceful assembly. Most often, it is organizers and participants in these events that criticize the Russian Federation and local administrations, or they are opposed to religious persecution in Crimea, or when they conduct or they gather evidence against the authorities or the law enforcement during these events. Now, these are religious celebrations or the other religious events. Now, there are hundreds of acts and fines for taking part in these events. the overall fines have been over 4 million rubles. There are 24 instances where participants were subject to administrative arrest. This year, in August of 2019, activists were arrested who were against building a park in the town of Sudak. This event was banned. At the same time, the administration of the town of Sudak published on its website the appeal not to hold unsanctioned mass events, noting that people would be sanctioned or arrested. And 20,000 ruble fine was assigned to the organizer. The Muslims are also banned from holding the religious celebration Quwat Bayram. The reason was that the organizers did not have an additional written decision from the spiritual leadership of the Muslims of Crimea. This is also something which is banned even by the laws of Russia. They also intimidate activists. The police provide them warnings before the event, warning them with administrative or penal sanctions for holding the unauthorized events. At least 7 of such warnings were given to the Crimean Tatars who were planning to celebrate the anniversary of their deportation, and also to celebrate the day of the Crimean Tatar Flag Day. Also, they use limitations on the places where peaceful assembly can be held in Crimea. In December of 2018, for example, in Sevastopol, there were only 3 places where people could hold peaceful assembly.
This concludes.
We should like to recommend to participating states of the OSCE to pay attention to the fact that the Russian Federation, with their actions, are violating the OSCE obligations on human rights, and they use Russian laws in which way they are also violating international humanitarian law. Thank you.
By Humanists International. Please, Tajikistan, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, moderator. The Republic of Tajikistan takes all necessary measures to ensure that the right to assembly and association are guaranteed. We have signed all of the international documents in this regard, including the International Covenant, where there is this guarantee of the right to peaceful assembly and association. We also have a very solid legal basis for ensuring that these rights are guaranteed. All political parties are active. We have 3 of them represented in Parliament, and there are more than 2,500 associations and NGOs representing national minorities associated with international organizations. Some of them are women's organizations, and some of them are closely associated with foreign governments in Tajikistan. And the legislation insists that political parties whose standards are not in line with those international standards not be able to act. And in particular, an Islamic party attempted to take power by force that resulted in the death of 52 individuals. And as a result, by a decision of the Supreme Court, the party was identified as a terrorist organization, and the individuals who perpetrated specific crimes were brought to justice. Now, through the leadership of the various parties, we have in fact a party that has organized some 20 armed groups that attacked a police station in the city of Baghdad. Many people lost their lives, and part of the armed forces as well were attacked, and some of their weapons were stolen. 14 soldiers lost their lives, and yet the representative of that party is able to participate in this meeting. Now, the perpetrators of these attacks turned out to be Mohadin Kalbiriv, the leader of the Islamic party that was declared illegal because of its attempt to take over the government. The various documents and plans were found in a search, together with evidence of the fact that they received $1.6 million from abroad to organize their illegal activities. And all of this gives witness to the fact that such a political party is not a political party at all, but rather a terrorist organization in accordance with a judicial decision. Now, the facts tell the story as it really is. We do follow international standards, but some of the parties in our country don't.
The speaker list is Humanist International, to be followed by the Open Dialogue Foundation. Humanist International, please, you have the floor.
Thank you. The Copenhagen document is clear. Everyone will have the right to peaceful assembly and demonstration, and any restrictions will be consistent with international standards. Yet, across the OTC region, there are clear violations, and here are just few examples. In Kazakhstan, authorities routinely deny permits for peaceful protests against government and disrupt even single-person unauthorized protests, arbitrarily detaining organizers and participants. In Hungary, a law on public assembly introduced last year gives police more discretion to ban and disband demonstrations. Turkey has seen an increase in arbitrary bans on public assemblies, and last year police detained students from leading universities for peaceful protests. And a number of students were held in pre-trial detention and many more prosecuted for crimes such as spreading terrorist propaganda and insulting the president. The Copenhagen document is clear. The right of association will be guaranteed, yet again there are clear violations by participating states. In Turkmenistan, it is illegal for unregistered NGOs to operate, and strict regulations create severe challenges for groups to register. Civil society activists are threatened with reprisal. And in Russia, authorities smear independent NGOs, with a number of foreign NGOs banned for being undesirable. Earlier this year, Anastasia Shvinka, coordinator for the pro-democracy NGO Open Russia, was put under house arrest for violating the undesirable organizations law. NGOs working on issues related to asylum and immigrants, women's rights, or LGBT rights in Poland report ongoing difficulties accessing previously available public funding, and some reported being smeared in pro-government media. The right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association is not only guaranteed under international law and commitment, but it's a fundamental good for society. It promotes the public discourse, diversity, and progress in the region, and it's an essential tool in achieving change and representation in society. We urge all participating states to protect it accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you for your intervention and observing the time limit. Next on the speakers list is the Open Dialogue Foundation, to be followed by the Italian Federation for Human Rights. The Open Dialogue Foundation, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. The Open Dialogue Foundation is a human rights NGO committed to fighting political persecution and human rights violation in the post-Soviet area. In the past few months, we have witnessed that freedom of assembly is under attack under the OSCE area and beyond. Worrying similarities in trends of repression of civil society have become evident. This summer's large-scale protests in Hong Kong have reminded us of Chinese unwillingness to accept dissent, repression, and attempts to obtain condemnation of the protests from Western and European side represented an evidence of this hostility towards civil activism. The controversial extradition law that quite understandably alarmed Hong Kong society, given China's consistent abuse of mutual legal assistance mechanisms such as Interpol's red notices, used to persecute dissidents or dissenting voices abroad. In the very same days that Hong Kongers were taking the streets, in Kazakhstan, citizens were protesting en masse against earlier presidential elections that were perceived as unfair and a merely staged transfer of power entailing no substantial change in government. However, these peaceful protests were met with harsh repression and mass arbitrary detention of more than 4,000 protesters, followed by also irregular interrogations. A few weeks later, Russian civil society showed its discontent in the largest peaceful demonstrations since 2012, openly defying police forces in the street in protest against the authorities' decision to ban opposition representatives from running in the Moscow City Council. While we witness a stronger engagement from the side of peaceful protesters, we want to condemn the authorities' continued violations of the freedom of assembly and the abuse of extremism charges as a tool of political persecution. Both Russia and Kazakhstan have been using laws aimed at discouraging the incitement of extremism with a worryingly broad scope as grounds for civil or criminal persecution. In Russia, peaceful protesters are even under the real threat of being deprived of their parental rights, as was the case of Peter and Elena Homskik, who came with their children to an authorized rally on August 3rd. In Kazakhstan, for example, a 23-year-old Alimjan Izbasarov was drafted to the army after participating in the peaceful protests on May 1st, 2019. While security is the main pillar of the OSCE measures aimed at ensuring the safety in the region, should not be abused to internally repress dissent or active engagement of civil society. We invite OSCE members to openly condemn the action of the participating states that do not respect their own commitments and to react to the negative influence of, for example, Chinese practices of repression. In the case of Kazakhstan, we also ask to join the recommendations of the UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism, who explicitly criticized the misuse of anti-extremism legislation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next speaker on the list is the Italian Federation for Human Rights, which will be followed by the International Platform Global Rights of Peaceful People. The next speaker, Italian Federation for Human Rights, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. The Italian Federation for Human Rights organizes international human rights monitoring missions to Kazakhstan. As a volunteer of Italian Federation for Human Rights, I've been observing peaceful protests in Almaty, Kazakhstan since April 2019. Continuing peaceful protests since March 2019 ended with mass arrests and criminal prosecutions of peaceful protests. Over 6,000 peaceful activists have been subjected to political prosecutions. Participants of peaceful protests, Oksana Shevchuk, Uzipa Jaukerova, Jazira Diomeova, Anwar Ashiraliyev, and Yerkin Kasiyev are currently facing extremism charges. Preemptive detentions take place to scare people and prevent activists from participating in peaceful protests, as it happened to myself 3 times since April 2019. During those protests, people demanded to release all political prisoners, respect human rights, return the name of the capital Astana, to stop Chinese expansions, and to conduct free elections. It was said that the authorities of Kazakhstan were willing to take concrete steps in improving the situation with the right to peaceful assembly. 2 weeks after peaceful anti-Chinese protests, at least 34 peaceful activists have been subjected to administrative charges during the last 3 days. 29 of them were arrested up to 15 days for participating in the unsanctioned protest. My colleagues in Kazakhstan have met with representatives of the EU delegation to Kazakhstan and embassies of Finland, Sweden, the Netherlands, Germany, and the United Kingdom to urge diplomatic missions to publicly condemn repressions against peaceful protesters, as diplomatic missions did during the protests in Russia this summer. We're deeply disappointed that we were told that diplomatic missions were not able to do so in case of Kazakhstan, and suggested we cooperate closely with the authoritarian regime of Kazakhstan. From the experience of human rights defenders, quiet diplomacy does not work with authoritarian countries unless democratic countries demand to release all political prisoners and respect the right to peaceful assembly. We welcome the adoption of the resolution of the European Parliament on the situation with human rights in Hong Kong and Kazakhstan. We found as an effective mechanism of ending repressions the introduction of Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act to the US Congress in response to mass repressions against peaceful protesters and activists in Hong Kong. We believe that the same measures could be applied to Kazakhstan in order to put an end to political repressions. We call on OSCE member states to activate embassies on the ground and to demand to release all political prisoners and stop repressions against peaceful protesters. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for your intervention. The next speaker is from the International Platform Global Rights of Peaceful People, which will be followed by Ukraine. Please, the International Platform Global Rights of Peaceful People, you have the floor.
Madam Moderator, distinguished participants, many of you, including myself, are political activists. My role in political life of Ukraine started in 2009. In these 10 years, I have taken part in dozens of actions, meetings, and demonstrations. Sometimes I also have organized information picketing. Now, many of these events take place in European countries, but before organizing an event, I study the local laws that enable me to organize a demonstration or picketing or a meeting. I'm sure you understand why I'm doing this on the basis of the law, so that I wouldn't have any problems with the police later on or with the law enforcement of that country. We all know that it is only the authorities and the state have the right to use violence or force, but if any of us are planning to hold an unsanctioned, unauthorized demonstration or to change the route of a planned march, we should be ready to face the violence which may be used by the police or the force that may be used by the police. So it is no use complaining to the OSCE to try to find some kind of protection. But we have seen in practice there are politicians who organize meetings and demonstrations that are set out to provoke, to be a form of provocation. There are those who are ordering these meetings in order to show what they want to show on the media and to have an impact on public opinion. This is what happened in Ukraine in the years 2013 and 14. Demonstrators used violence against the police. They seized government organizations, and there was chaos in Kiev for 3 months. We did not see anyone from European politicians or from American politicians. No one condemned this. On the contrary, European politicians, U.S. senators supported the violent overthrow in Kiev. They went to Maidan, they spoke there, and they said that the nationalists were freedom fighters. Here today we are reading in the news about the violence in Russia and in Moscow. Once again, we hear the voices from European politicians that support all those who have come out to the unsanctioned, unauthorized meetings and demonstrations. At the same time, we are also looking at what is happening in Paris, the Yellow Vests. What do we hear? European politicians condemn the demonstrators as vandals who are destroying Paris. And so we see these are double standards as to what is happening. If demonstrations are held under the flags of the European Union, it is supported. My recommendations: to support, through international law, only those actions, meetings, and protests that are held within the framework of the law. Secondly, to call to account all those European politicians and the United States who supported the armed seizure of power in Ukraine, and to say that they were complicit in the victims, thousands of victims of Ukraine.
Which will be followed by Switzerland. Please, Ukraine, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. At the outset, I would like to thank introducer for this thought-provoking and provocative, I would say, to some extent, presentation. But this is what we are here. I would like to ask you a question. Does you see the necessity for approval of existing OSCE commitments on the freedom of peaceful assembly and association? Because we believe that it's a vehicle for the exercise of many other civil, cultural, economic, political, and social rights. In my presentation, I will start from the recommendations. So first, we recommend and demand from the Russian Federation to fulfill the order of the International Court of Justice of April 2017 in Ukraine's case against Russia under the Convention on the Eradication of All Forms of Radical Discrimination, and lift the ban on the Medjlis of Crimean Tatar people, a traditional organ of indigenous people of Crimean Peninsula. Second, to recommend the OSCE ODIHR to address the issue of the implementation of freedom of associations in the situation of foreign occupation. Third, we recommend the special monitoring mission in Ukraine to enhance monitoring of freedom of peaceful assembly and association in the occupied territories of Ukraine, Crimea, and certain areas of Donbass. Fourth, we recommend the OSCE Slovak chairmanship to use all available assets and instruments to monitor and react to the worrying developments in the Russian Federation on violation of the OSCE commitments on the right of peaceful assembly and association. Also, you heard many examples today. Fifth, we recommend the ODIHR to assist the Russian authorities to help them address non-compliance with a variety of undertaking commitments. Proactive engagement of the ODIHR with the Russian authorities and civil society are necessary, in our view, to overcome extremely worrying tendencies in the country that pose significant risk to the Russian society and societies beyond Russian borders. And in remaining time, I would like just to make one example of non-compliance of Russian Federation with 1949 Geneva Conventions, where Russia, as the occupying power, started to apply its restrictive legislation on civil society organization on the Crimean Peninsula. As a result, their number dropped substantially. Moreover, Russia started to use some vulnerable groups, as for example national minorities of Crimea, for its propagandistic purposes, illegally established so-called national cultural autonomies of so-called Republic of Crimea or City of Sevastopol, of Crimean Tatars, Belarusians, Bulgarians, Estonians, Germans, Greeks, and others are utilized abroad, including in our meeting, in the Soviet Union-like manner to promote Russian propagandistic slogans of so-called flourishing Crimea. We believe it is miserable, and I conclude. Thank you, Madam Moderator.
Thank you. The next speaker is Switzerland, which will be followed by the Citizens Labor Rights Protection League. Switzerland, please, you have the floor.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Civil society plays an essential role in the collection and the dissemination of information in the OSCE region. Such information often concerns violations of human rights, and it is also important for achieving the objectives of a cooperation that our organization has set itself. Civil society is, however, threatened by laws that seek to restrict its margin of maneuver and to deprive it of funding. Civil society is discredited by discourse that labels civil society organizations as foreign agents. And in recent times, civil society has also been a victim of restrictions imposed on the digital sphere in the name of security or combating terrorism. Digital technologies, in principle, offer numerous opportunities for the exercise of these rights of freedom of peaceful association and assembly. Thanks to such technologies, members of civil society can communicate more amongst themselves beyond borders. In fact, NGOs can do their work to promote human rights in an innovative manner, also finding new sources of funding. Restrictions imposed by states in the digital sphere in violation of OSCE commitments and of international human rights law must therefore be combated. Therefore, Switzerland invites OSCE participating states to implement the OSCE guidelines on the freedom of peaceful assembly, as well as those relating to the protection of human rights defenders. Switzerland, in particular, encourages these states to pay particular attention to these aspects when they put in place legislation or various other measures concerning the digital area or sphere. Thank you.
Thank you for your intervention. Our next speaker will be the Citizens Labor Rights Protection League, which will be followed by Crude Accountability. I now give the floor to the Citizens Labor Rights Protection League.
Thank you. Although the laws in many countries in the OSCE region to hold freedom of assembly from a legal standpoint, there is a system of preliminary notification. Nevertheless, throughout the OSCE area, the actual events actually need to have preliminary authorization. This is, of course, something which contravenes national legislation as well as OEC standards themselves. I'm not trying to justify these actions by the authorities, but nevertheless, the authorities sometimes do take these steps because they have no choice but to do so. For example, a peaceful assembly is notified, but sometime before the event, on social networks, there are calls for public disorder and violence. On the eve of such events, a significant number of people who have political asylum in many European countries say that the authorities and the government will be toppled by using violence, and that they say that all those who don't come to these meetings, that their scores will be settled with them. They also spread slogans that we will overthrow the government if we have up to 10,000 demonstrators. And this is a day when this will be the end of the government, etc. We have seen this recently at the 24th meeting. I have seen the words of insults that have been bandied about. In other words, when we come to power, we will settle your scores, etc. I do not, of course, encourage steps taken by governments that are aimed to constrain the freedom of assembly. Governments need to take necessary measures for the assembly to remain peaceful. It's just that I have no choice but to point to the facts and to say that the OEC should develop new guiding principles so that under these conditions, the governments should know what to do. Today, in the Netherlands, near his house, a famous lawyer was shot down. Can we imagine what would happen if this happened in one of these countries? We would hear some very different rhetoric. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker will be from Crude Accountability, to be followed by United Kingdom on behalf of the European Union. I now give the floor to the speaker from Crude Accountability.
Thank you. I'd like to focus my remarks on environmental defenders who are increasingly under threat and exposed to grave risks simply for defending the basic human right to a clean and healthy environment. According to international watchdog group Global Witness, 2017 was the deadliest year on record for environmental defenders globally, with 207 environmental and land defenders killed around the world. In 2018, 164 environmental defenders were killed. 3 of those deaths occurred in the OSCE region in Ukraine: Yekaterina Ganjuk, Nikolai Yerema, and Nikolai Butchko. In addition to the murder of environmental defenders, harassment, intimidation, and pressure through administrative and legal action continue to be business as usual for governments and companies determined to stop environmental defenders. In Russia, Environmental Watch on the North Caucasus and other environmental NGOs, including Ecodefense, endure spurious legal charges and continued violence against their members. Environmental Watch's office has been raided 3 times in the past year by the authorities. Twice, these men were armed with automatic weapons and were wearing balaclavas. This follows the brutal December 2017 attack on Environmental Watch's coordinator, Andrei Rudomacha, which put him in the hospital for the better part of a month. Although the attack was recorded on video, the perpetrators have still not been found by the police. In Kazakhstan, environmental defender Sergei Salyanik was illegally detained by the police in May of this year for his participation in a 16-year-long campaign defending the rights of residents of the village of Beryozovka who suffered from toxic emissions from the Karachaganak oil and gas field. He was identified as a witness in a criminal case of distributing allegedly false information about the 2014 mass poisoning of children in Beryozovka by Karachaganak emissions. The criminal case is still open, meaning the authorities could continue to pressure him and other defenders working on this case. Max Bakayev is still wrongly serving time in a Kazakh prison colony for speaking out about land rights in the country. In Azerbaijan, Dr. Gubadi Badoglu, an economist and active member of EITI, was fired from his teaching position at the university for his participation in EITI events. In the United States, the current administration has proposed new legislation that would make it a felony offense of up to 20 years to protest oil and gas pipeline construction, even in cases of eminent domain when individuals are merely protecting their own property rights. Since November 2016, 17 states have introduced legislation that would criminalize participation in pipeline protests. Documented efforts to label environmental defenders as terrorists are chilling, as are documented cases of private security forces perpetrating violence against defenders on behalf of corporations. Throughout the OSCE region, environmental defenders are subject to frozen bank accounts, false legal accusations, charges of acting against the national interest of their country, inciting social discord, or working as foreign agents. At a time when climate change is the largest threat to the planet, environmental defenders are not only fighting to protect the environment, but they are fighting for their lives. We urgently call on the OSCE to work actively for the protection of environmentalists. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll move now to the next speaker on the list, which is United Kingdom on behalf of the European Union. They will be followed by the Institute for Reporters, Freedom and Safety. I now give the floor to United Kingdom on behalf of the European Union.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I'm honoured to speak on behalf of the European Union, and the following countries align with this statement: North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Iceland, Liechtenstein and Georgia. The alignment is not yet final. In 1989, we witnessed one of the largest acts of peaceful assembly, when 2 million people joined hands from Tallinn through Riga to Vilnius. Later that year, Slovaks and Czechs came together in the Velvet Revolution. 30 years on, the right to peaceful assembly and to association are as important at any time in our history, both online and offline, and must be protected. Whether it is, for example, LGBTI pride marches, climate strikes, protests against corruption and political and economic mismanagement, or using online platforms to discuss, debate and share information, freedom of peaceful assembly and association remain essential. As a fundamental right, freedom of peaceful assembly should, as far as is possible, be enjoyed without regulation. Peaceful assembly is not an absolute right and can be subject to restrictions to protect national security or public safety, but restrictions must be the exception and not the rule, and must be necessary and proportionate. Security should never be used as an excuse for preventing peaceful expression of opinion or demonstration of dissent. We note with particular concern the use of security concerns to restrict LGBTI events and pride marches, as well as the recent large-scale detention of peaceful protesters in the Russian Federation. Freedom of association remains under pressure, and we continue to be concerned about the shrinking space for civil society. Laws which restrict access to finance, which label NGOs as foreign agents or undesirable organizations, or otherwise stigmatize them, or which place legislative obstacles to the formation and functioning of OSCE civil society, run counter to international standards and OSCE commitments. Support to human rights defenders is an EU human rights priority, and we call on states to recognize the specific risks that human rights defenders face, noting that women human rights defenders can face additional risks. States must protect human rights defenders from abuses by third parties and take steps to promote the full realization of the rights of human rights defenders, including specifically the right to defend universal human rights. No one is above the law, but we remain deeply concerned by the arbitrary detention of individuals who work to defend human rights, including civil society actors, journalists, politicians, academics, lawyers, and others. States should respect the fact that dissenting views expressed peacefully and publicly are part of a functioning democracy and a free society. Madam Moderator, our recommendations are to OSCE participating states. Avoid using security concerns as a justification for restricting peaceful assembly. Avoid the excessive use of force and preemptive detentions. Engage with ODIHR's work to monitor peaceful assembly. States, in accordance with OSCE commitments, must permit organizations and individuals associated with them to seek, receive, manage and administer financial support from domestic, foreign and international entities without undue restrictions and requirements. States should recognize human rights defenders face specific risks and are often targets of serious abuse as a result of their works. Allow civil society the freedom to maintain contacts and cooperate with other individuals in their own country and abroad, as well as foreign governments and international organizations. Ensure that associations have the right to exercise their freedom of expression and opinion with respect to their objectives and activities.
Sorry
and
to
take
interrupt,
advantage of the ODIHR Venice Commission guidelines on freedom of peaceful assembly, freedom of association, and the ODIHR guidelines on protection of human rights defenders. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Also for providing recommendations, and thank you also to other speakers who have provided clear recommendations. The next speaker is from the Institute for Reporters, Freedom and Safety, to be followed by Kyrgyzstan. So the Institute for Reporters, Freedom and Safety, you have the floor.
Спасибо.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, in Azerbaijan over the last 5 years, day by day, the freedom of assembly and association is deteriorating on a daily basis. For 5 years, our organization, and in fact 30 other international and local organizations, are subject to judicial proceedings. We have been labeled Western agents, and now we're charged with money laundering. We supposedly engage in illegal business practices. We evade taxes. Now, the example of Azerbaijan is being followed by the Russian Federation. Criminal cases are being brought against leading anti-corruption organizations, and in particular one led by Navalny is being charged with tax evasion. Now, in Azerbaijan, this situation has been prevailing for 5 to 6 years. Today we are in a catastrophic situation. Our bank accounts have been frozen. Our offices have been closed down. We're not able to obtain any assistance from inside or outside the country. And everything that we had done by way of good work in previous years has been brought to naught. The right to freedom of assembly is violated. New NGOs are not registered. There are dozens of cases before the European Court of Human Rights concerning this, and when the European Court of Human Rights told the Azerbaijani authorities that they have to register a given organization, they ignored that. Recently, a case was won, the Human Rights Club. There is a decision of the ECHR, and yet despite the decision of the European Court of Human Rights, the Azerbaijani authorities are still not registering that human rights club. The new party called Republican Alternative, the National Front Party, they're not being able to register as political parties. They've been labeled illegal. Concerning discrimination of NGOs, we're often labeled as criminals. And when political leaders set up their own NGOs, which are financial pyramids and corruption organizations.
About the peaceful assembly, and he's just changed the topic. Please take the note.
But the Aliyev Fund is violating legislation.
Give the floor back to the speaker with a request to please make recommendations.
This fund, in fact, has billions of dollars available to it.
It's the out of topic. He should be talking about the NGO.
But the Aliyev Fund is a civil society organization, and yet it is run by the president and his daughter, and it has a budget in the billions.
Procedural issues, and the speaker is addressing the activities of associations.
He's talking about the vice president of Azerbaijan. He's talking about
I'm not
the
talking
corruption.
about vice president. I'm talking about Haydar Ali Foundation, which is corrupted structure,
Okay,
which is named
I'd
public
like to please,
association.
there is a point of order being made, and I'll then give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. He's talking about the corruption, and it's not the issue of corruption. The topic is not the corruption issues. The topic is about the peaceful assembly and association.
We have another point of order from...
He's talking about the NGO and corruption, not about the peaceful assembly association. This is my note and remark.
And I also
Thank
have
you.
a point of order from Canada, please.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. We've seen these point of orders in a number of sessions now. Just a reminder to all participants that in the OSCE Rules of Procedure, MC Doc 106, Section 6A, Paragraph 2E, it says a representative, and it's on the subject of these meetings, a representative raising a point of order may not speak on the substance of the matter under discussion. That is the responsibility of the moderator. You are certainly within your right to ask speakers to be on topic, but point of orders cannot be used for substance. They are only for procedural issues. And this is a point of order on procedural issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the point of order. The speaker, you have only 8 seconds left. I'll give you back the floor just to conclude.
Fond Yedar Aliyev.
The Aliyev Foundation, since its registration, has been flagrantly violating the rules and the laws concerning such organizations. They're supposed to publish their budgets, and yet they are using this money to bribe politicians abroad and within the country. I mean, we are called upon to be transparent as NGOs, but your foundation that has a budget of $10 billion over the last few years has not, in fact, been publishing its books at all.
To be followed by the Association of Shymkent Access Alumni. Please, Kyrgyzstan, I'll pass you the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Distinguished participants, the freedom of peace and assembly and association are basic political rights, without the efficient realization of which it is impossible to fully develop democracy and civil society institutes. Under the Constitution of Kyrgyzstan, the rights and freedoms of people are the highest values. No one should be discriminated against based on their gender, race, language, ethnic group, religion, political, or other opinions. At the same time, the right for peaceful assembly are important elements in the process of developing democracy in Kyrgyzstan. How this right is to be exercised is determined by the 2012 law on peaceful assembly. It is important to note that under this law, the notification of the authorities of the upcoming meeting is the right of organizers and not an obligation. Limiting public assembly with regard to time, place, or banning it can only be based on the decision of courts. Any doubts as to the justification of the ban or limitation should be interpreted for the benefit of ensuring the right to free assembly. This is why any limitation or ban of association or meeting which sets out to defend rights and freedoms are considered illegal, since it contradicts the principles and obligations set down in the Constitution of the Kyrgyz Republic. At the same time, the laws clearly establish the reasons for banning or limiting these events. It includes the propaganda of war, calls to violate national security, public order, or the rights and freedoms of other people. And thus, the courts have decided that there would be limitations or bans of holding certain meetings. In 2017, there were 19. In 2018, there were 4. And over the past 8 months of 2019, there have been 18. For example, this year, certain limitations were introduced on the time and place of holding certain political demonstrations, since there were individuals who posed a threat to public order and security. Still, we see that there is a trend of fewer meetings being held, from 364 down to 261, on such topics which pertain to the economic or social issues, general issues, or political and public policy. In conclusion, I would like to express our gratitude to the representatives of civil society of the Kyrgyz Republic and to international organizations for their active position in the defense of rights and freedoms and the promotion of international standards in the sphere. We do hope that this event will help us to significantly improve our work on the efficient protection of human rights and freedoms as universal values. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for your intervention. I'll now invite the next speaker on the list from the Association of Shymkent Access Alumni, and this will be followed by the Institute of Young Democrats. I now give the floor to the Association of Shymkent Access Alumni.
Thank you. My name is Rasarana. I'm the leader of this organization, and we carry out various projects in citizen responsibility, gender equality, and human rights defense. Now, unfortunately, we're confronted with a number of difficulties when it comes to peaceful assembly and association. The NGO, our NGO does not engage in any commercial activity. We're just a place, we just have an office where we prepare our projects. We have often asked for the municipal authorities to provide us with meeting space, and that has always been rejected. Now, there are various difficulties in our country with bloggers, and other NGOs. There is a difficulty with being able to travel internationally. It turns out that if representatives of NGOs say anything negative about the authorities, they're not in the circle of friends that receive information. That we would like to have more open competitions for government funding projects in order that it be possible for the best candidate to be selected. We are members of a special monitoring group that seeks to combat corruption in our city of Shunke, and unfortunately we have noted a number of cases of that corruption. Now the government has started to pay particular attention to the development of various socially innovative projects, especially with young people in Kazakhstan. Now we hope that the youth initiative, especially in the city of Shymkent, that we are promoting, will be supported, and that the authorities will understand that with an open society there must really be this guarantee of freedom of peaceful association and assembly. Thank you.
The next speaker on the list is from Institute of Young Democrats, which will be followed by Canada. I now pass the floor to the Institute of Young Democrats.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Freedom of expression is particularly important for human freedom and democratic development of society. The right to peaceful assembly and association, one of the fundamental freedoms legally guaranteed under international human rights law. Everyone has a right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom of hold opinions without interference, to hold opinions without interference, and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas throughout any media and regardless of frontiers. Freedom of speech covers not only those opinions and expressions that are acceptable to everyone and are favorably received, but also those ideas, opinions, or statements which are unacceptable to the governments, to the part of the society of certain individuals, which can cause shock and public outrage. Azerbaijani constitution guarantees fundamental freedoms: freedom of expression, freedom of peaceful assembly, and freedom of peaceful assembly. A central role of civil society, important contribution to participation and promotion of human rights in a society, and civil society is not only promoting and strengthening human rights values, but also strengthening legitimacy of democratic states. About national human rights institution in my country, national human rights institution that comply with the principle related to the status of national institutions, commonly known as a Paris Principle, and also comply with national constitution guarantees, and also national legislation, are playing a critical role in promoting and monitoring the effective implementation of international human rights standards at the national level in the country. And reports and speech with the significant limitation by the government's power over the national institutions in the country is unpreconceived, because Azerbaijani government respecting citizens' basic rights. Another important issue, the global trend which we observe recent years, how the civil society institutions become as a tool for the external players, influencing to the political process in the country before and during elections, referendum, and dismantling, ending stability in different countries. This is negative role of civil society in the political participation of citizenship, which we cannot ignore. Thank you.
Thank you for your intervention. I will now pass the floor to Canada, which will be followed by the Federation of Western Thrace Turks in Europe. Canada, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. My delegation said earlier this week that democracy was more than just the holding of elections. One key component of a functioning, healthy democracy is the ability for citizens to freely and peacefully assemble and associate. It is the means by which individuals and public groups can express their views to leaders and others, and in so doing promote public discourse and diversity as a peaceful tool to achieve changes in society. Last year, Canada welcomed ODIHR monitoring of the G7 summit in Charlevoix, Quebec. The final report of ODIHR's monitoring will be available shortly, very shortly, I believe, and we will carefully review the suggestions presented directly to us and more broadly to all participating states. All states have room to improve their implementation of freedom of peaceful assembly and association, and Canada is no exception. The first step, however, is the recognition of the importance of free and peaceful assembly and association. Unfortunately, for too many states in the OSC region, the right to freely assemble and organize, in much the same way as media freedom, is treated as a threat to be countered, as opposed to an essential foundation of a free and democratic society. We have observed disproportionate police responses to peaceful protests, as well as onerous restrictions on the right to assembly and overly harsh punishments directed towards protesters or demonstrators. A recent dispiriting example of this was seen in Moscow over the summer, and we reiterate our call to the Russian Federation to ensure full respect for freedom of peaceful assembly and expression. Additionally, restrictive legal frameworks, as seen in Russia and Central Asia, curtail the registration, funding, and activities of civil society organization. The shrinking space for civil society leads to a resultant decrease in the ability to freely assemble and organize. Civil society, as a vehicle for advocacy and civic participation in the development and implementation of government policies and programs, plays a key part in holding governments to account and facilitating and encouraging peaceful assembly and association. In closing, in addition to calling for participating states to respect their current and ongoing OSC commitments, we would put forward the following 3 recommendations for this session. Firstly, that ODIHR increase their training activities with law enforcement bodies in participating states, ensuring that police respond with appropriate de-escalatory measures when dealing with peaceful assemblies. Secondly, that OSC participating states review their existing laws on freedom of peaceful assembly and association, and to update or overturn those that unduly limits this right. And finally, that OSC participating states ensure that the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association is respected equally in digital contexts, and that citizens are free to assemble and organize both online and offline. Thank you.
Thank you for the intervention and clear recommendations. The next speaker is the Federation of Western Thrace Turks in Europe, which will be followed by Freedom House. I now give the floor to the Federation of Western Thrace Turks in Europe.
Dear Madam Moderator, distinguished delegates and representatives, the Copenhagen document and other OSCE commitments stipulate the right to freedom of association of persons belonging to national minorities. However, Greece ignores evidently its commitment regarding the right to freedom of association, as the associations established by the persons belonging to the Turkish community in Western Thrace, which bear the word Turkish in their names, have been either dissolved or denied registration by the Greek domestic courts. There are 3 judgments against Greece of the European Court of Human Rights regarding the dissolution of the Xanthi-Turkish Union and denial of registration of the Cultural Association of Turkish Women in the Prefecture of Rhodope and the Evros Prefecture Minority Youth Association. The European Court found Greece in 2007 and 2008 in violation of freedom of association guaranteed under Article 11 of the European Convention on Human Rights in these 3 separate cases. Despite the fact that the rulings were issued more than 10 years ago, their implementation by Greece is still pending. The Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe closely supervises the execution of the said European Court of Human Rights judgments under the name of Bekoursa and other groups of cases against Greece. At the Council of Europe's Committee of Ministers Human Rights meeting in December 2018, the Bekoursa and others group of cases related to the 3 associations of the Turkish community were also reviewed. The ministers' deputies invited the Greek authorities to rapidly take all necessary measures so that the applicants' cases are examined by the domestic courts in full and effective compliance with Article 11 of the European Convention on Human Rights and European Court judgments. The committee decided to resume the examination of these 3 cases at the first meeting following the delivery of the Court of Cassation's judgment in response to the appeal lodged by the Xanthi-Turkish Union, or its meeting on 23rd to 25th September 2019 at the latest. We strongly regret that Greece refuses to execute individual general measures in Bekoursa and others group of cases, although it persistently claims that it is considering the most appropriate solution to execute the said European Court of Human Rights judgments. We as ABTF call on Greece to fully respect the right to freedom of association of the Turkish community in Western Thrace and take, without any further delay, all necessary measures for the implementation of the European Court of Human Rights judgments regarding the Belarus and others group of cases. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. The next speaker on the list is Freedom House. This will be followed by Bewegung Gleiche Möglichkeiten für allen. I now give the floor to the speaker from Freedom House.
Good morning. The last year has witnessed a proliferation of threats to civil society in Ukraine. Freedom House's monitoring of the freedoms of association and peaceful assembly has shown how violence against civil society actors, journalists, and ordinary citizens exercising their rights contributes to a shrinking civic space in Ukraine. In 2018 alone, human rights defenders recorded more than 50 attacks against activists and already over 20 in the first half of 2019. These include the murders of Irina Nozdrovska, Mykola Bichko, and Katerina Handziuk, and attacks against Oleg Mikhailik and Vitaly Ustemenko. These incidents of violence affect actors from across the country who are involved in various areas of rights defense, including women's rights and gender activists, lawyers, environmentalists, anti-corruption activists, Roma advocates, and the LGBT community. In many cases, physical violence is used to prevent peaceful association and assembly. There were several instances in 2018 and 2019 when right-wing extremists hijacked events organized by Freedom House and partners in Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Poltava on LGBT rights. A similar incident occurred with a Roma rights event in Kyiv on May 27th. The threat of physical violence is compounded by inadequate investigation. The result is that for many in Ukraine, the freedoms of association, peaceful assembly, and expression remain unprotected. The Ukrainian government's support of patriotic education has provided, in some cases, funding and legitimacy to recipients affiliated with extremist right-wing groups that use or publicly call for vigilante violence against certain communities, including national and ethnic minorities, Roma, LGBT, and women and feminists. Fortunately, however, legislative pressure contributing to the shrinking civic space for civil society in Ukraine has largely subsided in recent years. We commend the Constitutional Court's June decision regarding the e-declarations requirement for anti-corruption activists. In addition, we applaud civil society and the Human Rights Ombudsperson for effectively mobilizing around these concerns. This level of response, organization, and activism reflects the health and robust nature of civil society in Ukraine. The remaining threats to the freedoms of association and peaceful assembly require responses from the Ukrainian authorities, Ukrainian civil society, and the international community. Freedom House urges the following actions and recommendations. To the Ukrainian authorities, establish law enforcement policies and practices to ensure that they take action to prevent and respond to unlawful disruption of civil society activity, passage of legislation prohibiting state bodies from providing financial or other assistance to groups which advocate the use of violence, conduct effective investigations of incidents where violence or the threat of violence has been used to suppress the freedoms of association and assembly, to OSCE participating states, ODIHR, and the OSCE Project Coordinators Unit in Ukraine, share best practices and experience in collaboration with civil society with the Ukrainian authorities to facilitate improvements in the response to threats of freedom of association and assembly. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next speaker on the list is the Bewegung Gleiche Möglichkeiten für allen, which will be followed by the World Uyghur Congress. So I now give the floor to the Bewegung Gleiche Möglichkeiten für allen.
Good morning, colleagues. I would like to start by noting some examples of the examples in which people in Uzbekistan have to work. In October of 2018, the Deputy Prime Minister of Uzbekistan came with an inspection to the region of the agricultural district. He didn't like how the farmers were working, and he forced people to stand in stagnant water as punishment. They had to stand there for 45 minutes. Then he forced them to run in front of his cars, of the cortege. This is a fact. And then he came to a different district, and he forced the people to hold rocks for 40 minutes. These are the conditions under which civil society has to work, and farmers are an independent legal entity. This deputy prime minister, at the same time, is very good friends with President Mirziyoyev. And to sanction him, basically, he was just demoted. Throughout Uzbekistan, we see that people are being torn out of their houses. Their houses are being taken away from them and given over to developers. Look at this photograph. It may seem that this is some kind of refugee camp, but these are people who were kicked out of their own homes. Their land was taken away from them. By way of compensation, they were only paid 1/10 of the value.
Make recommendations specific to the
Okay.
topic of freedom of peaceful assembly and association. Thank
Okay.
you.
But the people who spoke out against all of this, they came together to create their own structure to defend their own rights. But they have no opportunity to do so. Their structures were never registered. The courts look at these applications for years. They stand no chance of winning these cases. But also, there we have the National Guards, who are also under the orders of the president. Now, an electric nuclear power station is being built in the country now. Very many people are opposed to these dangerous facilities, and a referendum needs to be held. But it's not possible to hold a referendum because the citizens of Uzbekistan have absolutely no right to realize and defend their rights. Many people, together with myself, apply to the international community in order to make some efforts to prevent the building of this nuclear power station because it will jeopardize the lives of the people in the region and to the environment. Thank you.
Next on the list will be the World Uyghur Congress, followed by People in Need. I now give the floor to the World Uyghur Congress.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm speaking today on behalf of the World Uyghur Congress. World Uyghur Congress protects the Uyghurs' rights globally. The right to freedom of assembly and association is among most important and basic human rights. My people, Uyghurs, have long history being denied this right to peaceful assembly and association inside and outside of China for decades. Any attempts for the Uyghur people peaceful assembly have been met with violation and brutality. Every time Uyghurs try to demonstrate, they have been massacred, enforced disappearance, and other violation. In July 5, 2009, a peaceful demonstration in Urumqi bloody crackdown by the Chinese authority. Today, around 3 million Uyghurs are suffering. Uyghur, Kazakh, Kyrgyz, and Uzbek are suffering 21st century concentration camp. Now, outside the border of China, in the European Union and the OECD member states, the Uyghur people still not able to fully enjoy the basic right, despite facts that we are resident or citizen OECD member state. We are threatened by the Chinese government and ordered to not participate and demonstrate or in other human rights activism. On July 26, 2017, I personally was detained in Rome by Italian police shortly before I speak at the Italian Senate at the press conference. At every demonstration in Europe, even in Brussels, heard of the European Union, the Chinese government sent people to take the photos of the protesters' face in order to detain, punished by the family members of the protesters still living in China. In April 2017, Chinese embassy even paid students from Belgian University 150 euro to each to organize an illegal counter-protesters. Despite beside effort, national authority or right of freedom expressions being violated by Chinese government in Europe. In Central Asia, particularly Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, it is impossible for the Uyghur citizen to exercise this right at all. Due to intensive pressure from the Chinese government, Uyghur risk arrest or further punishment if they to try organize a demonstration. Besides this, Uyghur refugees and asylum seekers forced deported to the China for the decades. It is vital OSCE member states not allow China to deny their own citizen right to freedom, assembly, and association. We call all member states to strongly condemn attempts by Chinese government and urge them to protect its basic right, their residence on the citizen from the threat and the harassment. OSCE member state must be protect lives and right all of people within their borders. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker on the list will be from People in Need, followed by Salud et Miséricorde. I now give the floor to People in Need.
Thank you. People in Need is concerned about the worsening situation of civil society in Transnistria caused by the adoption of the 2018 NGO legislation. To a great extent, it copies Russia's notorious foreign agent law, and it forbids local non-profit organizations that receive foreign donations to engage in so-called political activity under the threat of liquidation. Since the law's adoption in February last year, it has become clear that the Transnistrian de facto authorities are determined to use it as an instrument to exert pressure on local civil society organizations and to limit the freedom of speech and freedom of peaceful assembly in the region even further. Under the legislation, any public debate or discussion touching upon social issues can be interpreted as a political activity and can therefore become a motive for shutting down the host organization. The Information and Legal Center a priori, one of the most active civil society organizations in the region, has become the first target of the new law. The de facto authorities interpreted two discussions that took place in 2018, and only one of them, in fact, was organized by a priori. In the other one, a priori just gave them a venue, as a political activity. Subsequently, the State Prosecutor's Office issued a verdict finding a priori guilty of violating the new law. The document contained multiple mistakes and was appealed by a priori first in the Tiraspol City Court and then in the Supreme Court. The organization lost in both cases. PIN was following the situation closely, and we strongly believe that a priori's right to a fair and public trial was violated in this case. Moreover, since November 2018, other kinds of pressure were exerted on a priori. For example, there was an attempt to pressure the landlord of a priori's office to terminate the lease. In June this year, a priori lodged a complaint with the Constitutional Court asking it to recognize the new NGO law as unconstitutional. They are currently awaiting the first session. While a priori's case is the only one that became public and received media attention, other organizations in the region were either served with a similar verdict or received a warning from special services requiring them to eliminate any traces of so-called political activity from their work. It is therefore clear that the new legislation presents a serious threat to effective and independent functioning of civil society organizations in Transnistria. PIN urges the de facto authorities of Transnistria to stop exerting pressure on CSOs, civil society organizations, and to revise the law. We also call on the OSCE ODIHR to encourage the de facto authorities to revise the NGO legal framework. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Because we've had some additions to the speaker list, we will have to reduce the time for the remaining speakers to 2.5 minutes. So thank you for your understanding and for keeping to this time limit. The next speaker on the list is Salud et Miséricorde, which will be followed by the Azerbaijan Press Council. So I now give the floor to Salud et Miséricorde.
It's not just Christians and their churches that are subject to persecution by jihadists, but also schools and anything that sniffs of the West. In fact, of the 2,869 schools in Burkina Faso, 1,111 have been closed over the last 3 years. But that jihad is spreading very quickly in Europe as well. There is a war against Christianity and its freedom of assembly. There are crimes, incivilities, vandalized churches, fires, destroyed statues, desecrated cemeteries. In France, 1,063 attacks against churches or Christian symbols have been reported in 2018, and that's 17% more than in 2017. On average, 2 churches are desecrated every year. And in most cases, the authorities and the media swipe the identity of the perpetrators under the carpet. They're accused of hatred and racism, and their anti-Christian attacks are not perceived as having to do anything to do with Islam. And that is how the European institutions, courts, and media are complices of the collective anti-Christian fanaticism ordered by Allah. Namely, and I quote, destroy the Christians to death until there are no churches, or the only religion is Islam. The teaching of hatred results in genocide, and what we're experiencing is a pre-genocide mentality. I would remind you of what was said by Monsignor Nona, the Chaldean Catholic Archbishop of Mosul, who spoke to us in 2014, and I quote, "Our present suffering is just a prelude to what you, Western and European Christians, will suffer in the near future. You think that all men are equal, but Islam does not say that all men are equal. You must take strong and courageous decisions. If you don't understand this very quickly, you will become victims of the enemy that you have welcomed in your own homes." My recommendation, my association calls on European institutions not only seriously to take what has been stated by Monsignor Nona, but also the opinion of the European Court of Human Rights, which declared in 2003 that Sharia is incompatible with the fundamental principles of democracy and with the standards of the European Convention of Human Rights. Thank you.
I'd like to invite the next speaker from our list from the Azerbaijan Press Council. This will be followed by Amnesty International. I now give the floor to the Azerbaijan Press Council.
Thank you very much. Azar Asfet, representative of the Press Council of Azerbaijan. As I represent a non-governmental organization and the Press Council, I can tell you that the Press Council doesn't only include representatives from the mass media of the government, but also opposition media. This is why we have never had any problems with the registration of holding meetings or any other issues with accountability. In Azerbaijan, we have over 50 journalist organizations, and they have never complained about any issues with registering their activities or any problems with funds. Now, we heard here today that supposedly some organizations are not able to register their work. In Azerbaijan, in order to register a political party, one must have at least 1,000 members. Since such a party did not present the documents to the Ministry of Justice, they were not able to register themselves, in spite of the fact that supposedly on Facebook they have 1,000 supporters. But that does not necessarily mean that they are official members. With regard to the Yagdar Aliyev Fund, this really is a non-governmental humanitarian fund. For 15 years, this fund has been in existence, and over that time, they have built hundreds of schools and rebuilt hundreds of schools, not only in Azerbaijan, but also beyond. This is something that needs to be encouraged and not criticized. With regard to their budget, Emin Gusev said that there was something like 10 billion. That's quite surprising to me, because where does he get this information from? If he at the same time says that this fund is not transparent, so how does he have these figures? He needs to explain that. Also, about 20 years ago, it was difficult for us to see demonstrations being organized, and that was difficult to do back then. But now we see that opposition members are attacking journalists. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Amnesty International. This will be followed by the Human Rights Commission of Kazakhstan. Amnesty International, please, you have
Thank
the
you,
floor.
Madam. I'm the director of the Belgian section of Amnesty International. I would like to speak about the right to freedom of assembly in Poland and France. Hundreds of individuals who took part in peaceful protest in recent years in Poland and France face criminalization and heavy-handed policing. In Poland, activists reported 696 proceedings against people who took part in peaceful protest across the country between April 2017 and August 2019. Amnesty International has documented clampdowns on freedom of assembly and expression in Poland that reflect an increasingly shrinking space, including a crackdown on protests manifested by the use of force against demonstrators, lack of accountability for breaches of the human rights, and criminalization of peaceful protest, differential treatment of assemblies in law and practice, surveillance of activists, and undermining of the independence of the judiciary, which plays a crucial role in upholding the right to freedom of assembly and expression. The differential treatment of assemblies is embedded in the Polish law. Since April 2017, for example, cyclical assemblies organized by the same entity at the same location several times a year have priority over other assemblies occurring in that location and at the same time. As a result, the governor of Mazovian province banned 36 assemblies in Warsaw between April 2017 and March 2018. Amnesty International has also raised concern about overcompetent police protection of assemblies. For example, in July 2019, the Equality March in Bialystok took place amidst widespread anti-LGBT rhetoric by politicians and some media outlets. According to police estimates, there were 1,000 participants and roughly 4,000 counter-protesters, and the latter threw firecrackers, cobblestones, and eggs at and physically attacked the marchers. While police protected the march overall, they failed to secure a safe access route and protect participants against attacks at the outset. In France,
Thank you. The next on the list is the Human Rights Commission of Kazakhstan, which will be followed by the Tajik Center for Human Rights. So I give the floor to the Human Rights Commission of Kazakhstan.
Thank you, Madam Moderator, ladies and gentlemen. The right to engage in peaceful assembly, meetings, demonstrations, etc., that's guaranteed by Article 32 of the Constitution of the Republic and also Article 19 of the International Covenant that has been ratified by Kazakhstan in December of 1995. Now, the standards of that document are subsumed into the legislation of Kazakhstan. Apart from that, we also have a law of 1995 about the organization of peaceful assembly, pickets, meetings, and so on. And now, according to the Human Rights Commission, which I represent, some of these standards have become out of date. Now, as you probably know, there has been a decision by the President to call for a reform in the Electoral Code. Now, I would call on NGOs that are strategic partners of our Human Rights Commission in Kazakhstan actively to participate in the reform and review of this Electoral Code, and at the same time to work on a new law on the right to peaceful assembly and association. Our commission has been calling for 10 years for improvements in the Electoral Code, and I remember that 10 years ago a new draft law on peaceful assembly was proposed by us and was presented, but it has so far remained a dead letter, but that is something that could be revived, and I would therefore appeal to colleagues from civil society to participate in that effort. Apart from that, dear colleagues, ODIHR could also contribute. We would like to hear some expert assessment by the ODIHR of a new draft law on peaceful assembly and association. And I can see my time is up, so thank you for your attention.
Recommendation and for staying within the time limit. Next will be the Tajik Center for Human Rights, to be followed by Kazakhstan. Passing the floor now to the Tajik Center for Human Rights.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Marzum Murziev. In Tajikistan, since Rahman came to power, there have been absolutely no sanctioned peaceful meetings or demonstrations. The word sanction itself is being interpreted as an authorization, and an unsanctioned action is perceived by society as a crime. An action of protest can only be conducted by the authorities themselves, thanks to their own fake organizations that seem to be youth organizations in front of the embassies of the United States or the EU or the OSCE. As you remember, 2 years ago, before the Oh Dear meeting in Warsaw, as you may remember, in the past 2 years before the meeting here in Warsaw, in Dushanbe, in front of the OSCE meetings, there were meetings against the participation of opposition in this event, and it was organized very aggressively, but no one was punished for this. Today, some activists who were involved in these events, as far as we have been able to find out, are now included in pro-government delegations. Now, the son-in-law of Rahmon came out with other people before this event. They were picketing, and they were accused of being part of a flash mob, and they had administrative arrest waged against them. Now, there was also a meeting that was organized in order to gather signatures, and thanks to that event, Mr. Rahmon personally canceled the decision with regard to the officials working in the Anti-Monopoly Institute. The work of the KGB and the Ministry of Internal Affairs still are suffering under the pressure put on them by the security services.
This will be a speaker from Kazakhstan, and then information and educational institution relevant concept. I now give the floor to the representative of Kazakhstan.
Thank you. Kazakhstan recognizes that freedom of assembly is a political right of citizens that must be developed. The legislation of Kazakhstan guarantees this fundamental human right. One of these guarantees is in the very constitution itself. And there is a special law on the way in which such assemblies and associations can be organized. Now, of course, there are certain restrictions that can be imposed in the interest of public law and order and various others. Obviously, there is also criminal liability for violations of those laws. And yet, Kazakh citizens take advantage of freedom of assembly and association. Over the last 5 years, there have been several thousand assemblies with 250,000 people participating in total. Most of those assemblies took place completely peacefully. And there have only been 3% of cases where violence occurred, and the principles of international law has been applied. Any restriction has to be reasonable and justified, and that is done only when there is an obvious violation of public order. It is, of course, up to the courts ultimately to decide. Now, the way in which assembly is controlled legally is very much in full conformity with international documents and instruments that have been ratified by the state. We continue to think about how we can improve the law on freedom of assembly and association. This will be done on the basis of our past experience and of international experience. With a view to strengthening the potential of civil society, the authorities are cooperating more and more with NGOs. We take advantage of international experience in this regard. Various recommendations have been made, and the Ministry of Social Development is looking at new ways to foster the development of non-commercial organizations. We are calling for experts to review our current law on non-commercial organizations and to see how it can be improved. So we await their recommendations. Thank you.
Followed by Azerbaijan. I now pass the floor to Information and Educational Institution Relevant Concept.
Дамы и господа,
Ladies and gentlemen, yes, the right to the freedom of association and assembly is one of the basic human rights. Nevertheless, I would like to remind you that this right should not undermine the rights of others. The issue here is the annual meeting in Poland in the Yashin region, the meeting of Polish Nationalists March, which tried to commemorate the crimes of a person who undermined the rights of minorities. The slogan is, "We are going to hang communists." And during these demonstrations, the Belarus ethnic minority is also facing communist ideology. Also, there are questions that need to be raised with regard to the persecution of activists and journalists with leftist socialist views in the Baltics. Now, I would like to tell you about the fate of journalist Mr. Spavetsky, who was charged with refuting the official interpretation of January 1990. He's been under arrest for 10 months. He's accused of espionage, but there has been no evidence presented. Also, the fundamental right to the freedom of expression is also violated in Latvia. Using many articles of the Penal Code, Yuri Alexeyev, head of a journalist portal, is being prosecuted for over 2 years now. He's being investigated. There has been no evidence presented. The investigation has gotten bogged down, which indicates that it is politically motivated. I think that these cases are absolutely unacceptable in the OSCE area. Thank you.
Next speaker is Azerbaijan, to be followed by the International Partnership for Human Rights. Azerbaijan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Azerbaijan state has created every condition for freedom of assembly association. It is an integral part of the Azerbaijan's democratic state building. For Republic of Azerbaijan, freedom of peaceful assembly and association is one of the democratic achievements. Azerbaijani government is determined to implement further commitments concerning development of democracy. There are about 3,500 NGOs in Azerbaijan, which make significant contribution to the development of all spheres of society through their initiative and practical steps. International organizations confirm that law on peaceful assembly appropriates to modern European standards. In 2008, after amendments on the law coordinated with Council of Europe Venice Commission, the Commission highly appreciated and called positive changes. OSCE Baku office declared that in the preparation of the law they were taken into account proposal of OSCE and term of peaceful assembly. Thus, the law was adopted coordinated with European institutions appropriate democratic standards. During the rallies, there were not any obstacles. The Baku executive power authorized more than 5 rallies of the National Council of Democratic Forces last and this year. Azerbaijan state has always created and will create conditions for holding such rallies at the places not disturbing the work of urban transport, movement of residents, the city, and harmony of dynamic city life. Our point of view is that opposition has to hold rallies according to the law. The government has to create appropriate opportunity to provide peaceful assembly and association. I would like to tell in short about amendments on legislation concerning NGOs in Azerbaijan. The accepted law are in the frame of commitment that Azerbaijan made under the international organizations. Azerbaijan was based on experience of leading countries in some changes in legislation. I would like to mention that there was held discussions with experts working on human rights, democracy, and other fields, chairs, organization, representative from Parliament, and Minister of Justice concerning on changes in NGO legislation in Azerbaijan. In general, changes on NGO legislation provides NGOs to be transparent and responsible towards their work. For example, NGOs hold neither an annual meeting nor a report activity. Law demands to do it open and transparent. Amendments on legislation address it to increase quantity, the mechanism. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next on our list is International Partnership for Human Rights, which will be followed by Citizen Research and Development Public Union. I now give the floor to the International Partnership for Human Rights.
Thank you, Madam Chair and dear participants. I'm speaking on behalf of IPHR, and I would like to raise attention to the situation in Central Asia, and we'll do this based on a paper we developed together with the Kazakhstan International Bureau for Human Rights and the Rule of Law, the Legal Prosperity Foundation, Nota Bene, Turkmen Initiative for Human Rights, and the Association for Human Rights in Central Asia. The harsh response of Kazakhstan's authorities to the mass protests surrounding the June presidential elections cast a shadow over the beginning of the new President Tokayev's period in office. The authorities have yet to properly investigate the documented violations of rights of thousands of peaceful protesters during these and other recent protests. Also, NGOs addressing issues such as LGBT and minority rights have been denied registration, and we heard this today also in the opening statement, the excellent opening statement about this trend throughout the OSCE, which should be really addressed as of top priority. Kyrgyzstan's current president, Jeenbekov, has adopted a more constructive approach to civil society than his predecessor, but NGOs still face widespread mistrust and suspicion. Following a new court ruling on his case, human rights defender Azimjan Askarov remains in prison contrary to the decision of the UN Human Rights Committee, and his health is seriously worsening. When I visited him in prison in November, he raised again his deep feelings of injustice after close to a decade in prison. Kyrgyzstan should release him for all human rights defenders to feel free in Kyrgyzstan and the OSCE region. Tajikistan, the UN Human Rights Committee criticized the chilling effect of recent NGO legislation, undue restriction on assemblies, and intimidation and harassment of independent journalists, opposition members, and lawyers working on politically sensitive cases. The issue of lawyers has also been raised in a recent statement of the Civic Solidarity Platform, and we believe this has also to be addressed, as otherwise the victims throughout the OSCE space will have nobody to turn to if lawyers are put in prison. In Turkmenistan, the authorities, as you know, strictly control civil society space, and they silence those who criticize and challenge a regime, including through imprisonment and disappearance. The government also tries to discredit and pressure exiled groups who report on developments of this closed country. Uzbekistan's President Mirziyoyev has set out to
I'm sorry,
enhance...
you have exceeded the time. I have to ask you to wrap up.
Okay, I will just wrap up by recommendation, just to say that the recent trends also in Uzbekistan clearly show that the governments have a misguided perception of the role of civil society. They view civil society actors as opponents and they fear criticism. Instead, they should view us as partners, embrace the efforts to promote reform, ensure compliance with international human rights standards, and it is crucial that OSCE states and institutions continue to remind all governments of the real role of civil society and stands up for the region's civil society actors. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, Citizen Research and Development Public Union, which will be followed by the Office of Civil Freedoms. So I invite Citizen Research and Development Public Union to take the floor.
Thank you very much. My name is Günel. I am from Azerbaijan, and I'm going to speak about the state of freedom of association. But I will try to begin from the recommendations. So I have a recommendation for Azerbaijan government as well as for OSCE members. For short-term solutions should be simplifying the existing NGO grant regulations, also limiting the power of Ministry of Justice over the NGOs, eliminating bureaucratic barriers to the NGOs' operations outside of Baku in the region of Azerbaijan, encouraging the European and US business communities to set the trend by being open to cooperation with civil societies in Azerbaijan and showing civil societies positive contributions to social progress. For long-term solutions, what we need, strengthening civil society's engagement in policymaking and developing a more sophisticated and consistent approach to supporting human rights and democracy in Azerbaijan. These are the recommendations, but it's very interesting to hear from my colleagues from NGOs in Azerbaijan that there is no any limitations or any obstacles for NGOs. I'm the head of a non-governmental NGO, and there are huge obstacles and problems. For example, we can't register any international grants because if international organization or foundations, they want to give a grant to NGO, they have to register the Minister of Justice and Minister of Finance. So it means in practice it's impossible. Okay, thanks to US government, there are still USAID in Azerbaijan, and they are trying to do some projects with NGOs, but unfortunately, European Commission, for example, in a practice, they are working mainly with the government bodies, with the ministers, and those NGOs that is in a coalition of these projects, they are they are established by ministers, or they are established by government bodies. So for independent NGO, there are a lot of problems. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next speaker on the list is Office of Civil Freedoms. This will be followed by Rights and Freedoms of Turkmenistan Citizens. I now give the floor to the Office of Civil Freedoms.
Thank you. I'm with the Office of Civil Freedoms of Uzbekistan. Now, as Mr. Arizadeh from the official delegation has said, we have more than 2,500 civil society associations, but there still are individual cases of pressure on NGOs. In an assessment of the implementation by the country of its international commitments, the Human Rights Commissioner has identified situations of excessive fines being imposed, closures of NGOs, and the Commissioner has also expressed a concern that the new requirements for financial accountability in connection with supposed combating of terrorism is also a restriction for NGOs. In May, a working party was set up for developing a new law, and we're very concerned that we have a paucity of information about this effort to draft a new law, and we're concerned by the fact that NGOs are not involved in this effort. We would like to make sure that these new legislative measures do not result in excessive control of NGOs or interference in our activities, and that we hope that the new law on non-commercial organizations will not result in excessive control or further restrictions. We have a substantial number of these non-commercial organizations already in the country. Now, obviously, it's normal that we should have to register, that we should have to engage in financial reporting, but these requirements should not be excessive. These should not be measures that impede our activity. We would like there to be simplification of the registration procedure and of the financial reporting procedures, and that there be appropriate sanctions applied when that is not the case, and that NGOs not simply be closed down because they have not reported financially. So all in all, the procedures should not be an obstacle to the development of civil society. There must be an appropriate balance between the respect for the rights of members of civil society to organize and the need for the state to control what they do.
Use the right of reply to please do so with my the colleague behind me. And the next speaker is the rights and freedoms of Turkmenistan citizens, which will be followed by the delegation of Georgia. I give the floor now to rights and freedoms of Turkmenistan citizens.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Turkmenistan is a very particular country, which is quite specific with regard to its radicalism in the post-Soviet era. The rule of law doesn't actually mean the rule of rights, although we do have Article 43 of our Constitution, which guarantees the freedom of assembly and association and demonstration, and there's even a provision about organizing them. In fact, this is absolutely impossible. It never has been the case, and it still is not possible in Turkmenistan since the independent Turkmen state came into existence. Now, the only instance when someone apply to hold a demonstration in 2004, he asked Mr. Niyazov to have the permission to hold a 2-day demonstration in the Balkanabad square. And he was detained, and for 2 years he was held in a psychiatric hospital. After the senators from the United States appealed to the president to give him the right to use the freedom of expression freely, only then he was liberated. And sometimes it's absolutely impossible to hold free assembly. But sometimes the pressures just build up, and the social pressures are so high that they risk exploding. Now, a few years ago, there were these explosions that took place. Women went out, they went to the kindergartens in these cities, and they said, how can you raise the fees for kindergartens where our pay has remained the same? And these women were beat up en masse. Now, after they dealt so cruelly with these women, they had to go and wash the blood off the streets. Now, this is the state of affairs today. Even if it is a spontaneous gathering of people, the result is tragic. So we see that these peaceful attempts to assemble were put down with violence.
You have, if you can please conclude.
Turkmenistan must comply with its own laws and to guarantee that the people should have the right for free assembly, meetings, and demonstrations. Thank you.
Thank you. Next on the list is the delegation of Georgia, which will be followed by the Union of Informed Citizens. Georgia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. So, occupation has disastrous results. Unfortunately, all citizens of Georgia, the country where I'm from, are well aware about that. As far as you know, 2 regions of Georgia are occupied by the Russian Federation, and due to that, all human rights, fundamental human rights, are violated on a daily basis, unfortunately. Firstly, let me draw your attention to one of the disastrous results of the occupation, which is portrayed in restriction of freedom of movement. In particular, it is portrayed like illegal process of borderization, illegal detentions, and also the closure of so-called crossing points. Illegal process of borderization is installation of barbed wires and fences alongside of occupation line. Also, erection of so-called border signs and setting so-called anti-fire dividing lines alongside of occupation line. One of the last cases what we had was back in this August this year, while Russian occupational forces set 413 meters fence in village, and that village was divided into 2 parts. Unfortunately, 2 residents of these particular villagers had to tear down their own houses, and those houses appeared on occupied regions. Afterwards, those particular village had appeared without irrigation or water channel, and this particular fact does not only violate the freedom of movement, but also right to property as well. Russian occupational forces, secondly, quite often detains people for so-called illegal border crossing reasons, people who are living in occupied region or alongside of occupation line. This year they already detained 800 people in post-occupied region, and last year they detained 128 people. Unfortunately, literally occupation has disastrous results as illegal detention in some cases are followed by fatal outcomes. Last year, one of the ethnic Georgian was illegally detained. He was tortured, and he was even murdered due to that. His name was Archil Tatunashvili, and while even the
I'm
body
sorry to
was
interrupt you.
murdered
I'm
over-
just interrupting to encourage you also to make recommendations relevant to the topics of the session on freedom of peaceful assembly and association. Thank you.
Thank you. I was referring on the fundamental rights that are violated on both occupied regions, and from our understanding, as Georgia has get the recommendations that all residents' rights who are living in both occupied regions should be protected, and Russia should protect all human rights of the residents who are living in both occupied regions. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker on the list is Union of Informed Citizens. This will be followed by the Crimean Tatar Resource Center. I pass the floor now to the Union of Informed Citizens.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. The level of freedom of assembly is one of the main indicators in democracy. If the state of freedom of assembly is, or under respective legislation in Russia, for example, gets worse every year, people in some Central Asian countries don't even know what freedom of assembly is. This means that all forces and organizations that share democratic values must take effective steps to develop the right of freedom of assembly in the OSCE region. Support of the effective exercise of the right of peaceful assemblies should consist of the following actions. 1. Public awareness raising. Citizens need to know their rights and responsibilities when conducting assembly, and then they have significantly more rights when their assembly is peaceful. Second, the capacity of potential organizers of assembly should be enhanced. In particular, the capacity to keep peacefulness of the assembly and to cooperate with media and the police. Third, the capacity of police should be raised, and a removal of non-peaceful people from rallies should be addressed. 4, assistance must be provided to media covering assemblies. Dissemination of objective information about the rally is very important, but it is no less important to document illegal interference against the protesters. 5, assistance to teams involved in protection of rights of victims of unlawful interference against the protesters. These actions must, of course, be driven from the situation and the atmosphere and the democracy traditions in the given country. At the same time, the legislation of member states should be improved, and the following should be clarified. 1, permit for peaceful assembly should not be required. The organizer should only notify the authorities. 2nd, no force should be applied on peaceful assembly when the rights of others are not disproportionately limited. And 3rd, participants and organizers of peaceful rallies should not be imprisoned or substantially fined if the assembly is or was peaceful. Thank you very much.
Thank you also for observing the time limit. The next on the list is Crimean Tatar Resource Center, followed by NGO Birlik. I now give the floor to Crimean Tatar Resource Center.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to express gratitude to those countries that supported the Luxembourg Declaration. Since the occupation of Crimea, freedom of association is being trampled on, and representatives of the Crimean Tatar people are not able to gather together. There is an elected assembly which it follows the laws of Ukraine. The Kurutai was elected by secret ballots. It deals with various socioeconomic issues. The last elections were held in 2013, and the observers claimed that the elections were free and fair, but it has now been labeled an extremist organization, and that is a clear violation of the rights of Crimean Tatars to engage in freedom of assembly and association. Members of the Mejlis are subject to repression. All rights to peaceful assembly of Crimean Tatars are violated. On 29 March, Tarim Barirov was fined for participating in a demonstration in favor of political prisoners. And then there was a refusal to provide premises for providing education in our national language. And people have been fined for such activities as well, and also for flying the Crimean flag. In June, activists who protested against the repression of Crimean Tatars were detained. 7 people were detained, and on the next day, 50 Crimean Tatars were also thrown in jail. In Moscow, an individual who protested against the repression of Crimean Tatars was sentenced to 4 years in a prison camp. And protesting in favor of democratic elections results in being fined. So what are the recommendations? We should insist that the Russian Federation implement the OSCE resolutions concerning the prohibition against the activities of the Mejlis. Under the aegis of the OSCE, protection should be afforded to Crimean Tatars, and our recommendations to the Russian Federation would be that all international commitments be fully fulfilled, and that there be a reversal of the judicial decisions that have been taken against Crimean Tatars in violation of their right to peaceful assembly and association.
Will have a chance to speak, but unfortunately, to also accommodate those delegations wanting to use the right of reply, we'll have to cut the speaking time down to 2 minutes per speaker. So thank you very much for your cooperation. The next speaker on the list is NGO Birlik, and this will be followed by Solidaros. I give the floor to NGO Birlik.
Distinguished guests and participants of the conference, my name is Abakhtiar Natalayev, and I would like to state that in the Republic of Karakalpakstan, the Uzbek authorities are banning the flying of the flag of Karakalpakstan to come out in peaceful assembly to stand up and demand their constitutional rights. For these activities, the authorities of Uzbekistan, without any arrest, detain, beat up people, they take away their phones, and they hold trials at midnight without witnesses, without any lawyers, without informing the families of the victims. We have written to all of the official agencies of Uzbekistan, including to the president, and our complaints are never considered or taken up. In Karakalpakstan, we have no parties that would stand up for the interests of Karakalpakstan. In order to unite and defend the peoples of Karakalpakstan, they even deny us to register our human rights movements. Our activists and citizens are arrested and persecuted. They are wiretapping us. They publish our videos openly on the internet. This is not democratic at all. This is an open and outright dictatorship of Mirziyoyev. It is a genocide, occupation, ethnocide, and forced assimilation of Karakalpakstan into Uzbekistan. This is why, for us, the people of Karakalpakstan, we need independence like we need air and like we need the water that we need to drink. Thank you very much.
Next on the list is Solidaros. After that, the delegation of Belarus. I now give the floor to Solidaros.
Thank you very much. I represent the organization called Solidars from Berlin, and we'd like to draw attention to 2 specific concrete violations of the right to peaceful assembly in the Russian Federation. The first was the case in Moscow, on which there is now a judicial proceeding. The Moscow case has to do with the demonstrations in 27 July to protest against the non-registration of candidates to the Moscow Duma. Now, in this demonstration, more than 1,300 participants were arrested. 14 criminal cases have been brought against them. There have been hundreds of searches and seizures. Dozens of people have been beaten up by members of the municipal guard. A number of individuals have been sentenced to 2 to 5 years in prison camp. They have thrown plastic bottles at police officers, grabbed them by the hand, and when detained, the individual fell down and damaged the hand of a police officer in falling. Posted something on Twitter. So these are the sorts of charges. Now, the massive searches and seizures are extraordinary. The second case has to do with combating corruption. There have been seizures of offices and apartments in Krasnodar. Then there have been slanderous arrests. This is something that threatens the physical integrity of the individual because there are published photographs. There's another individual who was arrested under Article 200.2 in Moscow for participating in meetings without a permit. So these are very serious violations. Please pay attention to them.
Youth Public Union. Belarus, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. In Belarus, we give due attention to the issue of ensuring human rights. The national laws are agreed with the norms of international law. In addition to the Constitution, the issue of human rights defense is reflected in all of our codes and laws. As of 1 January of 2019 in Belarus, we have registered 2,923 associations and 15 political parties. Annually, we registered 100 new public associations. The increase in the number of these associations shows that in our country we consistently ensure the constitutional right of citizens to realize the social and civil rights. The area of social and public associations is very varied and covers many different aspects of society. Some legislative provisions. We are preparing amendments to the law with regard to the registration of political parties and associations. We're planning to give political parties and associations the opportunity to apply for registration and exchange information electronically. What's more, the draft law contains changes to simplify registration, including the amount of information which is needed to be sent for application, and the minimal number of founders of associations is going to be reduced. There's a working group on preparing the amendments, which also includes participants of political parties and associations. The draft law is to be considered by the Parliament in December. Thank you.
Next speaker is Reformist Youth Public Union. This will be followed by Center for the Development of Democracy and Human Rights. I'd like to invite the speaker from Reformist Youth Public Union. You have the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am the president of this Azerbaijan Association Young Reformers. The subject that we're talking about today is extremely important and very topical. Insofar as Azerbaijan is concerned, I can tell you that in our country there are many opportunities for civil society organizations to develop, and one of the most important aspects is that we are significant partners for the implementation of projects. So the government does not impose any restrictions on NGOs. In accordance with the civil society law, NGOs and citizens participate in decisions taken at the national and local levels in our countries. And they also fulfill the function of civil society control of governmental entities. Those who have previously drafted the report on activities of NGOs have criticized this, but there are no problems of freedom of assembly. Any calls for the opposition to organize assemblies and meetings have been accepted. Permits are given, provided, of course, that there are no violations of public order that could disturb the daily lives of citizens. The places for meetings and rallies are very convenient, just a few kilometers from the center of cities, and some people want to engage in illegal actions on centrally located streets that could make it difficult for citizens who are not involved in the meetings simply to go about their daily lives. Thank you.
This is Center for the Development of Democracy and Human Rights, to be followed by then the last on the list, Information Center Chirac. I now give the floor to Center for the Development of Democracy and Human Rights.
Thank you. I'll be speaking on the issue of safeguarding NGO participation in the OSCE events. In recent months, NGO participation has become an issue of heated debate as some governments that restrict civil society space in their own countries are pushing for the adoption of new procedures to limit NGO access to OSCE events. Some states have prosecuted NGOs on the basis of vaguely worded anti-extremism and anti-terrorism legislation that does not meet rule of law standards, and this legislation is increasingly used to prosecute NGOs who have nothing to do with violence. States are now using the same unfounded claims to justify restricting NGO access to OSCE. The Civic Solidarity Platform, the OSCE-wide NGO coalition, believes that restricting NGO participation on arbitrary and politically motivated basis would be a tremendous setback for the Helsinki process and betrayal of OSCE founding values. Paragraph 16 of the Helsinki 92 document outlines the only ground for restricting NGO participation, stating that access will be not allowed for persons or organizations which resort to the use of violence or publicly condone terrorism or the use of violence. Currently, there is no procedure for implementing paragraph 16, although traditionally it has fallen to the chairmanship in office or ODIHR to take decisions in cases when a state objects to participation of a specific NGO. And it becomes a matter of blackmailing, and the OSCE is held hostage to a consensus decision-making when a state in question retaliates when other decisions are taken on budget or HDM agenda or others. Our recommendations are on this important matter that implementation of paragraph 16 should be ensured through the establishment of a transparent rule of law and predictable procedure to prevent arbitrariness and politically motivated approach. Should be based not on consensus by states, but entrusted to an OSCE mandate holder, and be based on expert analysis by independent experts. And the OSCE has enough expertise on anti-terrorism issues. And finally,
sorry, we'll have to ask you to conclude. We are out of time.
States, last sentence, states asking to block an NGO should outline precise, compelling, and evidence-based claims that NGO in question has been involved or condones terrorism or violence. And this has to be reviewed by experts, and an NGO in question should be given the right to present its own case. Thank you.
Thank you. We're almost to the end of the speaker list. The last speaker on the list is Information Center Chirac. Please, you have the floor.
Good morning, participants of the conference. I would like to tell you a little bit about Kazakhstan, and this is with regard to the curfew that has been introduced since midnight of this year. All cafes, restaurants, and all other businesses have to be closed. The political and national guards, although in other areas of Uzbekistan, have never introduced such a curfew. This is a colonial occupation of the dictator Shavkat Mirziyoyev, and it is basically a prison for the people of Kazakhstan.
From the floor, from Uzbekistan.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Please ask the speaker to keep up to the topic of the session, please.
Right. Please, you have the floor, and just encouraging you to make recommendations on the topic of the session.
Thank you for your attention.
Okay, we have reached the end of the speakers list. At this point in the session, we'll be turning to the delegations who have expressed the interest to exercise the right to reply. We have 16 delegations on the list, so we ask you to please keep these interventions to 1 minute, and in advance asking for the patience of the interpreters because it looks like we'll be slightly over time. The first delegation on the list is Albania. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. In response to some allegation made early this meeting, I would like to repeat our position that Albania considers the Greek minority living in Albania as part and precious value of our society. We consider that human rights and particularly minority rights can only be ensured in a society where dialogue, understanding, and cultural diversity are viewed as sources of enrichment. The law on minorities adopted in October 2017, which is in line with Council of Europe and OSCE recommendations, provides the prohibition of discrimination, freedom of association and the right to representation, freedom of religion, freedom of expression and information, participation in public, cultural, social and economic life, preservation of cultural identity, education, right to education in the language of national minority, the use of minority language. Thank you.
Thank you. The next delegation, Kazakhstan. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Moderator. I would refrain from giving reply to the statements of Open Dialogue Foundation and FIDU, for their statements were paid for by fugitive Kazakh banker. I would reply to the statement of the United States and Kazakhstan International Bureau for Human Rights. As I mentioned in my inaugural speech 2 days ago, the President of Kazakhstan has stated that citizens will have greater rights to hold peaceful rallies in key locations, not just on the outskirts of cities. He said that protests should be embraced as long as they are peaceful and lawful. This has already been implemented. Protesters were free to demonstrate during recent marches in several regions of Kazakhstan and in the city of Almaty. Nobody was detained despite the fact that some protests were unauthorized. Local officials engaged with demonstrators and discussed with them their grievances. Thank you.
Thank you. Next on my list is the delegation of Latvia. I invite you to take the floor.
Thank you, Moderator. In reply to the Russian Federation on certain gatherings in Riga on March 16, during and after the Second World War, Latvia came under the occupation of two totalitarian regimes, those of the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. Through repression and terror, the regimes forcibly drafted many people in the occupied Latvia to join the armed forces of one or the other state. March 16 is not an official Remembrance Day, and people on their private initiative pay respects to the fallen soldiers. The senior officials and members of the government do not participate in those gatherings. And with regard to civil society's mentioning of Mr. Yuri Alexeyev, indeed, Latvia's authorities have initiated criminal proceedings that are currently ongoing. These proceedings have been taking place solely in connection to possible criminal offenses and are not connected with Mr. Alexeyev's professional activities as a journalist. Thank you.
Thank you. Next right to reply will be delegation of Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I would like to use the right of reply with regard to remarks made by the distinguished introducer of this session on the developments of June 20 in Tbilisi. Currently, the General Prosecutor's Office of Georgia conducts an investigation according to the Criminal Code of Georgia on the fact of possible abuse of power by law enforcement officers. One of them is in pre-trial detention, while two officers are released on bail. Respective investigative activities are conducted within the frames of this investigation. Thank you.
Thank you. Next on the list is the United States. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Moderator.
I wish to exercise a right of reply to the Russian Federation, which has raised rising violent extremism in the OSCE region. We disagree with the Russian Federation's tactics to confront this trend. In the United States, we hold the freedom to peacefully assemble paramount, yet we maintain procedures with due process to take action against those who incite imminent violence. As to Group 1488, which the Russian Federation raised, members of the group were arrested in 2008 for planning the assassination of a presidential candidate. More recently, our Department of Justice created a hate crimes prevention and enforcement initiative led by the Civil Rights Division, reflecting our adherence to OSCE commitments and international law. Thank you, Madam Moderator.
Thank you. I'll now give the floor to Bulgaria.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I would like to use my right of reply to the remarks made by the introducer of this session, as well as to the Russian Federation. First, the Bulgarian citizens have the right to peaceful assembly in compliance with the legal procedure for their organization and conduct according to the Constitution. The competent Bulgarian authorities, including judicial authorities, are not referred to such cases that were mentioned by the introducer. We therefore consider these remarks false and not made in a good faith. I use this opportunity to draw attention to the historic agreement on good neighborly relations signed in 2017 between Bulgaria and the Republic of North Macedonia, and to reiterate its crucial importance. Second, Bulgaria strongly condemns the annual demonstration known as Lukov March. In March this year, Sofia municipality, together with the Organization of Jews in Bulgaria, joined by leaders of the World Jewish Congress, held a procession which showed rejection of intolerance and anti-Semitism, as well as willingness to address all forms of racism. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Greece.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. First of all, it is to be noted that the NGO ABTTF continues to use inaccurately the term of Turkish community in Thrace instead of Muslim minority, which is the correct term used in the 1923 Treaty of Lausanne, which established the status of the said religion minority in Greece. It is regretful to see that the statement in question is referring to issues that have already been answered by Greece many times in the OSCE format, but allow me to repeat. In Thrace, there is a thriving civil society comprising a large number of Muslim minority associations and NGOs that have been registered by the competent courts. As regards the 2008 European Court of Human Rights rulings, Greece has done its utmost in order to enable their implementation by the Greek courts. In particular, in October 2017, the Greek Parliament adopted Law 4491, which introduced an amendment to the Code of Civil Procedure, allowing for the re-examination of the case of minority units by the Greek courts. Although the Court of First Instance and the Court of Appeal of Thrace had dismissed the new request submitted by the Minority Association, an overall assessment of the implementation of this law can only be made after the completion of the ongoing judicial procedures. In any case, the Greek government has to respect the rulings of the independent Greek judicial system. Thank you.
Thank you. Next on my list is Estonia. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'll reply to the Russian Federation on their description of the nature of certain events in Estonia. The events that the Russian Federation referred to were private commemorative events of the victims of the battles and tragedies of the Second World War, as is taking place in many other countries who have suffered from the disasters of that war. Thank you.
Thank you. I will now pass the floor to France.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. This delegation greatly deplores the statements that have been made by the representative of Salut et Miséricorde. Hate speech has no place at HDIM or elsewhere. especially at a session on freedom of assembly and association. I cannot understand how what the individual said could be related to our session. France combats all hate speech, including hate speech against Christians and against Muslims. And the law of 2005 concerning separation of church and state applies to Islam as any other religion. Islam is the second most important religion in our country and has its place in our society. Amnesty International has briefly referred to France, and I would just like to ensure that we do guarantee the right of peaceful assembly as guaranteed by our Constitution and by the European Convention of Human Rights.
Thank you. Next on my list is Tajikistan. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. The Republic of Tajikistan guarantees the right of peaceful assembly and the freedom of association. However, in the work of NGOs and political parties that have the propaganda of national, racial, or religious war, or to call for the violent toppling of the government regime, are banned. We do have parties of religious party. We have banning of financing of religious organizations and parties by organizations from abroad. Also, with regard to the criminal profits of proceeds, and in order to ensure that we prohibit this, we have amended the laws about associations. We also have a register of humanitarian assistance, which is purely of an information nature. Also, every year, they have to publish their financial documents. We have also met with civil society and international organizations. In conclusion, I just wanted to say that with regard to the recommendations on the UN Commission on Human Rights, there was a necessity to review the laws on the work of associations, and the result was that our measures and laws are fully in line with international standards. Thank you.
Thank you. Next on the list is Romania.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. In response to specific points raised today, I would like to make the following remarks. The Romanian government considers violence against peaceful protesters unacceptable and unjustifiable. The government has no intention to limit in any way the freedom of peaceful assembly and association. As a democratic society, we cherish it as we cherish the cooperation with the civil society and its valuable support. The Romanian legislations ensure full protections of all fundamental rights and freedoms. Romania has an independent justice system that guarantees that national legislation is enforced and any abuse, including by employees of public institutions, is punished. As already mentioned, the Romanian prosecutors are conducting an investigation concerning the events that took place last year on 10 August. This investigation is pending. The authorities are keeping the public informed in a very transparent manner. The Romanian authorities are looking into this situation with utmost seriousness and in strict accordance with the law and our democratic values. I would add that similar protests with 24,000 people participating on 10 August this year were peaceful and free of incidents. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I now pass the floor to Finland on behalf of the European Union.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I pass the floor to the representative.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. We take issue with one intolerant statement that was made today during the session by Salut and Misericorde. To those who are calling here for unequal treatment and discrimination, we say that the Universal Declaration on Human Rights is clear. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, and everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration.
Thank you. I'll now give the floor to Lithuania.
Thank you. I would like to exercise the right of reply and respond to the allegations of relevant concept regarding the prosecution of Algirdas Paleckis. The judicial process of a Lithuanian citizen continues. Therefore, we would not like to prejudge the outcome of a case and interfere in the work of a court. The case will be dealt with as any other case in accordance with existing national laws and in line with international commitments of Lithuania. Also, the defendant has the right to use all the judicial procedures guaranteed by legislation. I thank you.
Thank you. And next we have the delegation of Uzbekistan. You have the floor.
Спасибо.
Thank you. I'd like to take advantage of my right of reply to respond to something that has been said by a number of NGOs. I would like to declare that human rights are ensured in my country, including the right to freedom of assembly and association. That is done on an equal basis right across the territory of Uzbekistan with no discrimination, and in particular in Karakalpakstan, which is an autonomous republic within the confines of the Republic of Uzbekistan. It is part and parcel of our country. Insofar as measures taken regarding what was said by NPS, we are involved in appropriate investigative work, and when any difficulties arise, the authorities take the appropriate measures to resolve those difficulties. Thank you.
To now invite the delegation of Poland to take the floor.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. And in response to the points made in the session, I would like to use my right of reply and say that in line with our OSCE commitments related to freedom of assembly and association, Poland strives to facilitate and protect public assemblies. We also have a good cooperation with ODIHR in this regard. ODIHR monitored public assemblies in Poland 2 times already, and the recommendations have been carefully reviewed. And with regard to the counter-manifestations related to the Pride Parade in Białystok that was mentioned by Amnesty International Belgium, I'd like to stress that immediately after the incidents, the Podlaska District Police established a special unit in charge of identifying the persons who resorted to hate speech and the use of violence and who were interfering with the march. And immediately after the parade, 52 persons have been apprehended and the proceedings are ongoing. Thank you.
Thank you. The last delegation on the list to exercise the right of reply is Azerbaijan. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. I will use my right of reply concerning the issue raised by delegation of USA. No bank accounts of civil society subjects are frozen at present. Some of them have problems on tax evasion. As it should be paid, there can be problems. About the NGO legislation, I already said about this in my statement. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We've now reached the end of the session. I'd like to thank very much all of our speakers, also our introducer. Unfortunately, we don't have time to hear some final thoughts today because we are already running over time. Thank you very much to everyone who was in the audience and participated. Thank you to the interpreters. I'd like to remind you that the speakers list for the next session will be open 1 hour before the session starts, so that's at 2 o'clock. Please arrive early because when the limit is reached 50 speakers, the list will be closed, and only participants present with their own badge may sign up on the speakers list. Please leave the headset and receiver in the room, and you are encouraged to participate in the side events. Thank you very much.